Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth. The lamps are dim, the thoughts are gentle, and tonight we're taking a slightly different path. We're going to picture a reality where the ground beneath our feet simply stops its slow turn. A version of Earth where the planet's rotation just ends. I realize that sounds like the opening scene of a sci-fi film, the kind where skyscrapers crumble and satellites rain down from orbit. But here, in this quiet little corner of the internet, we don't shout about catastrophe. We move slowly. We pose the odd questions, we turn them over from every side, and if they lead us somewhere unexpected, we let them. So tonight, let's step away from the usual blur of spinning days and ticking seconds. Let's literally hit pause and ask, what if the Earth just stopped rotating? Of course, it hasn't. Not yet, anyway. Your feet are still planted solidly on a world that's whipping around at more than 1,600 km per hour at the equator, even if you don't feel a thing. And that's part of what makes this mental exercise so quietly uncanny. We don't feel the spin. We don't hear it. We don't see it. And yet, it shapes nearly everything about our everyday existence. From how wind crosses the ocean's surface to how long the sun seems to linger overhead. It chooses the pattern of day and night, the schedule of our meals, even the rituals of our pets, who somehow sense dinner time before you've even touched the fridge handle. But suppose for reasons we can't explain, all of that simply stopped. Maybe it's abrupt. Maybe some vast, inscrutable force grabs the planet and breaks it to a standstill. Or maybe the slowdown stretches across decades or centuries, so gradual that at first no one really notices. The reality is, our current understanding of physics doesn't make room for either option without severe fallout. Still, tonight isn't about what's probable, it's about what unfolds if the wildly improbable somehow becomes real. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Right now, as you're listening, the Earth is spinning from west to east. That's why the sun appears to come up in the east and sink in the west. That rotation gives us our days and nights, the gentle back and forth of brightness and darkness that humans have lived with for as long as we've had eyes to perceive it. If the Earth's spin stopped, that familiar cycle would be completely rearranged. Instead of a 24-hour rotation, one full turn would take a full year. The sun would creep upward, sliding across the sky over the span of months. One hemisphere would roast under never-ending daylight, while the other would sit inside a prolonged, deep freeze night. Temperatures would swing to brutal extremes. Crops would no longer grow the way we know them to. Wildlife would strain to adjust. And we humans, well, we'd have to rethink just about everything. But we'll get there. There's a lot to unravel before we even reach the question of sunrises and seasons. Because the moment Earth's rotation ceases, a cascade of events unfolds very, very fast. First, there's inertia. A simple idea, but no less powerful for its simplicity. Anything in motion tends to stay that way unless something forces it to change. You've felt it in a car when the driver slams on the brakes. Your body keeps gliding forward for a split second. Now scale that sensation up to include everything on the planet. As Earth spins, everything on its surface spins with it. The land, the atmosphere, the oceans, the buildings. You. If the planet locked up in an instant, coming to a full, immediate standstill, that inertia would turn disastrous. The air wouldn't stop on a dime. Neither would the seas or anything not anchored deep into solid rock cars, trees, the top layer of water on lakes and oceans. All of it would keep racing along at over 1,000 km per hour. The outcome would be, to put it mildly, catastrophic. Winds would tear across the surface like invisible tidal waves. Anything not fused to the bedrock would be hurled eastward. Entire forests could be flattened. Skyscrapers could crumble purely from the sheer force of the air slamming into them. Not because of bombs or quakes, but because the planet simply let go of its spin. The oceans would surge sideways, carried forward by their own momentum, stacking into moving walls of water taller than any we've ever witnessed. Shorelines would vanish. Whole regions would be swallowed. It wouldn't be an apocalypse of fire, but of motion or more precisely, of the sudden absence of motion. But remember, we're treating this as a thought experiment, a space for imagination, not a reason to panic. So let's suppose it doesn't happen in a single instant. Let's imagine the rotation slows down over years or decades, giving air, water, and life some time to adjust. The wind patterns would still warp. The oceans would still shift, but less violently. Instead of a single titanic disaster, we'd be facing a slow unspooling of familiar systems, one after another, each failing to adapt to the changing rules. At first, you might barely pick up on it. Days start to lengthen, just a little. A few extra seconds, then a few minutes, then half an hour. Your morning alarm still rings. Your coffee tastes no different. But each week, the sunrise drifts later and later. Before long, the shift becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, most of what used to be nighttime is washed in daylight. Then you hit stretches where it's bright for a full 24 hours, then for weeks, then for months. Meanwhile, across the globe, another region hasn't seen the sun in what feels like forever. Cities fall into a deepening dusk, then absolute black. Temperatures nosedive. Vegetation falters. Power consumption soars just to keep people warm and give them something resembling daylight. Eventually, all the insulation and LED bulbs in the world can't really compensate for a missing sun. And if you happen to live on the illuminated side, you're not exactly lucky. The sun climbs higher in the sky week after week, and the atmosphere dries out and heats up. Reservoirs shrink as water evaporates, fields wither, people abandon the surface for underground structures or reflective shelters, anything to get out of the constant glare. If you've ever brushed your hand against a scorching car dashboard in mid-July, imagine that sensation stretched across months. It's not just hot, it's oppressive, inescapable. Sunlight without pause. But it's not only the relentless light causing problems. Without rotation, the entire circulation of the atmosphere would reorganize. The jet streams, those swift rivers of air high overhead, owe part of their strength and shape to Earth's spin. Take that away, and they'd wobble, then die out. Storms would morph in both structure and behavior. Hurricanes, for instance, depend heavily on the planet's rotation to develop their familiar spiraling form. Without that spin, you might still get storms, but they'd behave in wildly different ways. Less rotation could mean stronger vertical motion, more intense updrafts, or sprawling sluggish weather systems that camp over the same region for weeks instead of days. And then there's the magnetic field. Our molten, churning iron core, together with Earth's rotation, powers the geodynamo that generates our planetary shield. That invisible barrier protects us from cosmic rays and charged particles from the sun. It's the reason compasses work, and part of why our atmosphere still clings to us, instead of being stripped away by solar wind. Halt the rotation, and that dynamo could weaken or disappear. Not overnight, but gradually, as the internal circulation patterns shift. Over time, more radiation would reach the ground, especially in equatorial regions. Auroras could bloom far from the poles, painting unfamiliar skies, but along with them might come radiation burns, electronic glitches, and hardware failures. Even so, life tends to adapt. That's one of the few constants we've seen over centuries of watching ecosystems respond to change. Certain species might even flourish under the new conditions. Hardy desert plants could take over vast regions of the sun-blasted side, while deep sea life might expand into newly frozen lakes on the dark side. Migration routes would twist into new shapes as animals chase light, warmth, or food in directions that used to make no sense at all. And people, we respond. That's what we do. We design, we improvise, we endure. Entire cities might uproot and reform along the twilight bands, that thin strip between unending day and permanent night where conditions are barely tolerable. Technology would matter, but so would instinct. We'd develop ways to farm in sealed, artificial ecosystems, to harvest energy where the sun never sets or never rises, to pull water out of the air or reclaim it from waste. Mobile communities might form, following the slowly creeping line between light and darkness like a migrating herd. Still, many would refuse to leave home. People always do. They stay put when the sky never brightens, when the grid fails, when the cold crawls under every door. Others would become literal sun chasers, living in caravans or on constantly traveling ships, inching west with the sunlight. It might sound bleak, but there could also be a strange, quiet dignity in that way of life. The stubborn persistence of people choosing to remain on a planet that no longer spins, yet still insisting on finding what's possible. We haven't even brushed against the question of what happens to calendars or how we might redefine the word day. If the world stopped turning, what would that even mean anymore? How do you slice time into pieces when the sun no longer rises and falls on a schedule anyone recognizes? Maybe we'd revert to older measures seasons, harvests, body clocks. Or maybe we'd build entirely new systems. Digital calendars keyed to carefully programmed artificial cycles, glowing on screens that don't care where the sun is or if it moves. But that belongs to a later part of the journey. For now, let's just stay with this first uncanny instant. The point at which the spinning stops and everything else begins to shift. If you've ever drifted off to the whir of a ceiling fan or the low rumble of a train in motion, you already know something about the comfort of constant, quiet rotation. Earth's spin is invisible, but it's part of that background lull we all live inside. It's in the way dawn light creeps into your room. It's in the way shadows stretch and shrink as hours pass. You can't hear it or touch it, but your body has always known it was there. Even if we rarely think about it, that rotation underpins how our days are structured. It hands us a 24-hour framework. It slices time into reliable segments that our biology has synchronized with over many, many generations. Our sleep cycles, our appetite, our attention, even our moods, all of them ride along with the turning of the earth. Take that motion away, and the body doesn't just get confused. It starts searching for a signal it no longer recognizes, something it can't quite name. This isn't only about sunrise and sunset. The planet's rotation gives us a dependable tempo, a built-in sense of when to act and when to rest. Light and dark regulate melatonin, the sleep hormone. In darkness, levels rise. As the sun climbs, they fall. The pattern is so deep that even in communities without clocks, people still drift toward roughly the same sleeping and waking cycles. That's not just habit, that's wiring. So what happens when the earth no longer turns? Suddenly daylight doesn't slide in and out every few hours. It doesn't show up at dawn and retreat at dusk. On one side of the world, it simply remains for days, then weeks, then months. The sky stays bright, refusing to dim. On the other, night never loosens its grip. The sun has been absent for weeks, and there's no indication it's coming back anytime soon. The human brain isn't built for that mismatch. When the world around us stops lining up with our internal clocks, those delicate circadian rhythms start to drift. Without cues, what scientists call zeitgebers, like sunlight, regular meals, or social routines, the body falls out of sync. People might start waking up at strange hours, sleeping through what feels like the middle of the day, feeling fully alert at what used to be midnight, even though night has stretched on for weeks. On the ever-daylight side, insomnia would spread, not because everyone is stressed, but because the brain has lost its sense of when to switch off. Light floods through windows no matter what the clock says. Street lamps become irrelevant. People tape blackout fabric over every crack, slip on sleep masks, build faux night inside their homes just to simulate a darkness that no longer arrives on its own. Sleep hygiene stops being a wellness tip and becomes a survival tool. On the never-ending night side, the problem flips. Month after month of darkness starts to feel less like rest and more like suffocation. Without sunlight, depression likely climbs. Vitamin D levels crash. Even with bright artificial lighting, something is missing. People can go weeks without ever seeing their own shadows. The world feels small, enclosed, heavy. Time stops punctuating itself. Each day blurs into the next, one long, stretched-out moment that's lost its edges. And it doesn't stop with sleep. Digestion responds differently when circadian patterns are disrupted. Hunger signals become random, metabolism shifts, hormones fall out of sync, focus wavers, decision-making slows, immune defenses weaken. Even the way our bodies handle medications can change depending on where they fall in what used to be the cycle of light and dark. We actually have small previews of this from places that already experience long stretches of daylight or darkness: northern Norway, Antarctica, and similar regions. During their polar nights and midnight suns, people often describe exhaustion, irritability, a vague sense of time slipping. They lean heavily on routine and social structure to stay grounded. Schools and workplaces keep normal schedules, even if noon outdoors is pitch black or eerily bright. But for them, those phases come and go. In a world where the spin has stopped, the change doesn't cycle. It just is. And it's not only humans who would struggle. Plants too depend on the planet's rotation. They open to the light and close in darkness. They gauge day length to decide when to flower, when to fruit, when to go dormant. Remove steady days and nights, and some species simply won't grow. Others may survive, but in strange, distorted ways. Blooming off-season, staying stunted or slipping into a permanent dormancy they never leave. Animals would be thrown off balance as well. Migratory birds navigate in part by the changing length and angle of daylight. Many insects use the sun's position as a compass. Nocturnal creatures rely on night for safety and hunting. In a world with no sunset or no sunrise, those carefully tuned behaviors begin to unravel. Predators might prowl constantly. Prey might lose their hours of refuge. Entire food webs could tilt in unpredictable directions. Pollinators like bees and moths are especially vulnerable. Bees, for instance, use the sun's location to map flowers and guide their hive mates through a dance that encodes direction and distance. If the sun stops moving, that dance stops making sense. Foragers could get lost. Colonies might collapse. Pollination would decline. Whole ecosystems could shift, not primarily because of temperature or rainfall, but because the sun stopped acting as a reliable clock. Some animals would adapt, eventually. Over many generations, evolution would favor traits better suited to endless light or constant night. Eyes might change size or sensitivity. Internal clocks might be rewired. But evolution is slow. For countless species, the change would be too fast. Extinction doesn't always look like a dramatic die-off. Sometimes it's just a pattern that quietly can't sustain itself anymore. For us, many of these deeper shifts would take longer to notice. At first, we'd cling to our old timetables. We'd set alarms, cling to 9 to 5 workdays, insist on dinner at 7. But bit by bit, the conflict between our biology and the frozen sky would start to show. Sleep clinics would overflow. Employers might install full-spectrum light therapy rooms. Schools could begin scheduling classes around individual chronotypes, letting kids learn when they're naturally alert instead of forcing everyone into one rigid morning bell. On the perpetual day side, people would burrow downward or build heavily shielded homes, stepping outside only in carefully chosen windows. The sun would become something to hide from, not chase. On the night side, entire metro areas might run on artificial daylight just to keep people functioning. Not to make things brighter, but to reintroduce structure to give the brain something resembling a pattern, even if we have to invent it from scratch. Travel would turn bizarre. Crossing into the twilight zone, that thin region where light and dark still alternate however slowly, would scramble you. Your internal clock says one thing, the sky says something else. Time zones would stop being about longitude and start being about light exposure. Cities might abandon traditional time standards altogether, sinking instead to the position of the Terminator, that creeping line between day and night that now slinks around the globe just once per year. Bit by bit, culture would catch up. Songs and stories about morning and evening might start to feel nostalgic, set in a world that no longer exists. Dawn ceremonies and sunset rituals would need new anchors. Maybe entirely new holidays would emerge, tied to the sun's slow annual crawl instead of its daily arc. Fresh ways of noting time. Fresh ways of finding rhythm when the natural one has gone silent. And under all of that, your body keeps trying. Your cells keep oscillating. Your brain keeps hunting for cycles, for patterns to hold on to. It's still running code written for a spinning earth, still listening for cues from a rotation that's no longer there. But this is only one layer of the story. Once the spin disappears, it doesn't just rewrite sleep and sunlight, it changes the face of the sky, the motion of air, and soon, even the shape and place of the oceans themselves. There's something unsettling about imagining stillness on this scale. The Earth, after all, has never truly been still, not in any way that matters to us. It has always been in motion, always turning beneath our feet, even if that turning is soundless, invisible, constant. We live out our entire lives on a planet that carries us eastward, whether we're aware of it or not. In this imagined world, though, the question is oddly simple. What if one day that spin simply ended? Not slowed to a crawl, not staggered in a long, uneven wobble, just stopped. It's a question that tugs at everything we assume is stable. Because if the Earth were to slam on the cosmic brakes and freeze its rotation, the fallout wouldn't be limited to calendars or weather apps. It would be written into the physics of motion itself. At the moment, everything on the planet's surface is in motion. The oceans, the clouds, people, animals, tectonic plates, the entire envelope of air, they're all moving along with the spin. And that motion isn't gentle. At the equator, the surface speed is about 1,670 km/h, roughly 1,000 mph. Fast enough that, if you weren't attached to the ground, you'd cross a country in under an hour. But we are attached to rock, to gravity, to everything else that's turning with us. Now try to picture that motion ending. Not easing down over geological epochs, but stopping abruptly, as if someone locked the planet in place. In that instant, inertia, the same principle that throws your body forward in a hard stop, becomes a planet-wide event. The crust halts. The air does not. Neither do the oceans. Anything not anchored deep in the bedrock keeps sliding along because nothing has told it to slow down. Structures would fail, not primarily from shaking, but from side-loading. Skyscrapers would shear or topple under lateral forces they were never designed to withstand. Glass would explode, not from vibration, but from air trying to keep going at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Trees would rip from the soil and fall eastward, forests laid flat not by axes or fire, but by the momentum of still-moving wind. The seas would follow the same logic. Water, especially near the equator, would surge forward, piling into continental margins, driving far inland. Low-lying coast would be smashed and drowned by water that no longer cares about tides in the way we knew them. The oceans would slosh like water in a bowl someone has suddenly grabbed and held rigid. And that's only the surface. Pressure systems in the atmosphere would be thrown into chaos. The Coriolis effect, that subtle twisting that bends air and ocean currents, would vanish with the rotation. Jet streams would unravel. Storm tracks that used to curve would lose their shape and coherence. Tropical cyclones, which rely on rotation to form and spin, might stop appearing as we know them, or transform into unfamiliar storm types we don't know how to model. Above all that, satellites would feel the difference. Their precise orbits depend on Earth's shape and rotation. Without the spin, the planet's equatorial bulge would slowly begin to relax, and the redistribution of mass would slightly alter gravity around the globe. Orbits designed for one gravitational shape would now be wrong. Communication constellations, GPS, Earth-observing platforms, many would drift off course or fail unless carefully adjusted. That smoothing of the planet's shape wouldn't happen overnight, but it would start as soon as the rotation stopped. Earth is a bit wider at the equator than at the poles because centrifugal force gently tugs mass outward. Remove the spin, and that outward pull vanishes. Gravity begins pulling everything back toward a more perfect sphere. Water follows gravity's lead. Oceans migrate poleward, equatorial shorelines drain away, revealing seabeds that haven't seen air in hundreds of millions of years. Polar regions, on the other hand, would flood lowlands swallowed as water spills into those basins. Places that are currently inland in Canada, northern Europe, and Siberia could become coastal or go entirely under. Mountains might subtly rise or sink, not from plate collisions, but from the way weight is redistributed on the crust. Continental plates would feel new stresses as mass shifts. The Earth groans and creaks, trying to find a new equilibrium. Some regions would see more quakes, not just aftershocks. but entirely new fault activity as rocks crack under new loads. The disruption wouldn't stop with landscapes and coastlines. Our entire civilization is organized around an assumption. The ground stays roughly where it is, the seas stay roughly where we've mapped them, and the air behaves in roughly predictable ways. Transportation, agriculture, zoning laws, building codes, all of it relies on a spinning world stability. We don't design houses to withstand 500 km/h winds. We don't build ports assuming the ocean might begin crawling inland for centuries. Most of humanity lives near coasts or at low elevations, exactly where these changes would hurt most. If the slowdown were unimaginably gradual, shaved off bit by bit over millions of years, life might be able to keep up. Air currents would evolve, ocean basins would reshape slowly, species would adapt. Human societies would move, rebuild, and retool bit by bit. Coastal megacities would march inland. Power grids would shift. Economies would restructure around the new patterns of light and dark. But a sudden stop offers no such grace. It's simply too much energy. The kinetic energy locked up in Earth's spin is on the order of 2x 1029 joules. To bring that to zero, you'd need to dissipate more energy than all nuclear weapons on Earth could ever produce, by a factor so large it's barely meaningful. No natural process we know, short of a collision with a planet-sized object, could do it. So, if we're being honest, the only way this could happen is in the realm of suspended disbelief, either through some unknown cosmic intervention or through hypothetical technology far beyond anything humans can currently conceive. We're not talking about mega projects. We're talking about rewriting the rules of planetary engineering. That places this entire exercise squarely in the territory of speculative fiction. And yet, it teaches us something. By following the consequences of a stop spin, we're reminded how the planet's balance is both robust and fragile. Robust in that it's persisted for billions of years. Fragile in that small changes over long timescales can have world-altering effects. The Earth probably won't stop rotating, at least not before the sun itself changes into something unrecognizable and ends this particular chapter of the solar system. But our dependence on that spin, on that quiet motion, we never notice. There's a lesson in recognizing it. We don't have to sense the rotation for it to shape us. We don't have to hear the planet turning for our entire lives to be timed by it. And if that rotation were ever taken away, the loudest noises wouldn't come from the planet itself, but from everything still moving when the ground stopped. The shrieking wind, the collapsing waves, the world surprised by sudden stillness. Yet not all motion is about speed. Some of it is about light. And if Earth's rotation were taken out of the story, light would start playing by different rules too. Most days, the sky is something we glance at only when we need it. It helps us guess the hour without checking a phone. It echoes our routines in small, precise ways. The angle of a shadow sliding across a desk. The way colors shift from cool morning blues to warmer evening golds. We read these signs almost without thinking. They're soothing because they repeat. But that comfort, like so much else, rests on a spinning world. Take away the rotation, and the sky doesn't just change, it forgets its choreography. Right now, nearly everything we see overhead is performance, not direct motion. The sun's rising and setting, the stars dragging themselves westward over the course of the night. The whole show is an illusion created by our rotating frame of reference. The sun isn't really circling us once per day. We're turning into and out of its light. Animals rely on that illusion. Plants depend on it. We schedule our lives around it. Stop the spin, and the act ends. Start with the sun. Instead of appearing each morning in the east and tracing an arc to the west, the sun would appear to decelerate. Its path would stretch out. Sunrise would become sluggish. Eventually, from some locations it would seem almost fixed, hovering at a particular angle and barely shifting from day to day. Over time, now measured in months, not hours, the sun would slide across the sky, completing what used to be a daily journey in the span of a whole year. A sunrise wouldn't be a brief event on the horizon. It would be a drawn-out transition, taking weeks to climb to full daylight. Morning would turn into something more like a season-long, slow, and heavily textured. By the time the sun reached its highest point, you'd be months into that day. The descent towards sunset would be just as protracted. On the sunlit side, this drawn-out day would be relentless. Light intensity would build and hold. Shadows would shift in tiny increments. Heat would accumulate far beyond what we know as summer. Window shades wouldn't come down for an evening. They'd stay down for survival. The sun wouldn't cross the sky every few hours. It would just hover, oppressive and persistent. On the far side, the dark, half-nothing, comparable happens. The sun simply fails to arrive. People would wait for some hint of orange on the horizon that never appears. Weeks stretch into months. The constellations, instead of wheeling across the night, stay where they are. The sky becomes a fixed diagram. You could memorize it in such detail that you'd know every star's place, and it would never prove you wrong. The moon would join this strangeness. It already keeps one face locked toward Earth as it orbits, but from the ground, we see it move, because of our own spin. Without that rotation, its behavior would feel unfamiliar. It could hang for weeks over roughly the same patch of sky. Its rising and setting would depend only on the interplay between its orbit and Earth's path around the sun, not on a daily planetary spin. Some places might see it stuck near the horizon for long stretches. Others might go weeks without it. Traditional ways of reading the sky would falter. Sundials would become antique curiosities instead of functional tools. Even telescopes would be pointed differently. There would be no more tracking planets as they drift through constellations over a single night, no more following the Milky Way's arc as it slowly pivots overhead. The drama of motion would be erased. All that's left is gradual drift over long intervals. For everyday life, this stillness would bleed into smaller, weirder details. Streetlights would flick on at wrong times, not because the technology broke, but because light no longer coordinates with standard hours. Two cities sharing the same clock might live under totally different skies, one in perpetual afternoon, one in untouched night. Even color shifts would take on new meaning. Our blue daytime sky exists thanks to Rayleigh scattering. Shorter blue wavelengths of sunlight bounce more in the atmosphere, while longer red wavelengths pass through. At sunrise and sunset, sunlight cuts a longer path through the air, filtering out more blue and leaving reds, oranges, and pinks to dominate. Stretch that process across days instead of minutes, and you get sunrises that last weeks. Whole spans of time drenched in a single, slowly deepening palette. Imagine a 7-day-long dawn, with the sky staying gold and rose-tinted from one morning to the next. Or a sunset that lingers for weeks, saturating the world in red and copper before the light finally slips away. It might be stunning. It might also be exhausting. Beauty, stretched too far, can become oppressive in its own way. Clouds wouldn't escape the reshaping either. Their forms and motions are sculpted by the atmosphere's movement, which itself is shaped in part by rotation. Without the usual spin-driven winds, clouds could thicken and remain pinned over certain areas, barely drifting. Enormous, semi-permanent mats of cloud cover might hang in the same slice of sky, dumping rain on one region for weeks, while another just beyond remains bone dry. Weather forecasting, already complex, would become almost guesswork. We'd no longer see the familiar procession of fronts sweeping across continents. Instead, we deal with systems that pop up and refuse to leave, or that shift unpredictably in response to subtle changes in local heating and terrain. A single clear sky might reign over a region for a month with no clouds at all, baking whatever lies beneath. Elsewhere, a dense gray ceiling might hold firm, turning midday into a kind of eternal, dim twilight. Even contrails, those thin white lines left by planes, would behave differently. In a slower, more stagnant atmosphere, they'd disperse more slowly. hanging like scars across the sky long after the aircraft has vanished. They'd tell a story of past movement in a sky that now barely moves. All of this, the standing sun, the frozen constellations, the parked clouds, wouldn't just rewrite meteorology. It would reach into our minds. Humans are wired to notice cycles, to rely on repeating patterns. The gradual arc of light has always been one of our most trustworthy references. Take away that arc, and something quiet but important comes loose inside. In a sky that ceases to move, people might feel strangely unmoored, disoriented even when they're perfectly still. It's like trying to track time in a windowless room with no clocks and no routine. Technically, the hours pass the same way, but they lose their shape. We try to replace what's missing. We'd build systems, artificial dawns, and curated sunsets, interior lighting schemes that mimic the old sky, wearable tech that tells you where in a manufactured day you stand. And they might help. They'd be functional. But they wouldn't fully replicate the experience of seeing the world above you change on its own, without human input. For cultures that encoded knowledge in the stars, whose myths are mapped onto seasonal constellations, whose rituals line up with equinoxes and solstices, there'd be a deep sense of loss. Legends attached to wandering planets and shifting star paths would inch toward abstraction. Nights would feel less like a living storybook and more like a fixed mural. The sky becomes less like a companion and more like a ceiling. Painted, stilled, alien. Yet even a motionless sky can become meaningful. People would adapt to this new pace, learning to read the positions of the sun and stars not across hours, but across months. Instruments more like enormous architectural calendars might be built, structures that catch a single shaft of sunlight on a particular wall once a year, tracking the slow movement of the star overhead. Rituals would follow. Communities might gather for the moment when the sun, after half a year of rising, finally begins to drop, or when the first star of the season reappears after being lost in glare. Time would be measured not in sunrises, but in the distance the sun has slid along the horizon since last month. Because even when the sky stops, people don't. We look up. We look for something to follow. Even if it takes a year for the sun to cross from one side of the sky to the other, someone will stand there, noting the change, building meaning around it. And while the show overhead slows to almost nothing, another kind of show is just beginning. With the spin gone, the air itself starts to behave in new, sometimes violent ways. The atmosphere loses the guidance it once had, and in the absence of that spin, the winds begin to rewrite their own rules. On the side of the world facing the sun, the shift sneaks in quietly. Light keeps pouring down. The sky keeps shining. Morning looks like morning at first. Then the unease begins. The angle of the light feels wrong, hanging too long in the same place. And midday heat lingers far into what used to be afternoon. Someone glances at a clock, then at the horizon, and realizes the sun hasn't moved since breakfast. In the beginning, it doesn't feel like disaster. The sun's movement just seems slower than usual, like a lazy summer day, stretched out. Shadows look about the same from 1 hour to the next. The gentle brightness of early day doesn't fade. People joke about extra long mornings. Behind the scenes, scientists are already alarmed. They've been watching the data drift for months, rotation speed decreasing by tiny fractions, a once steady spin beginning to wobble, then stall. By the time anyone outside the research community notices something is truly wrong, the process is nearly done. The rotation has all but ceased. On the sunward side, that means one thing. Day has arrived, and it's not planning on leaving. For a little while, life still clings to the old patterns. School bells ring. Workdays start at 9. People eat dinner under a sun that never sinks. At first, some people love it. More time for outdoor projects, for late walks, for solar energy production. Stores stay open later. Solar panels generate power at what feels like 2 p.m. forever. Streetlights begin to seem redundant, but the charm wears off. With every passing week, the continuous illumination becomes less pleasant. Buildings soak up heat, radiating it back out day and night. Asphalt softens. Tires age faster. Electronics overheat, not from heavy usage, but from constant exposure to warmth. Plants that depend on cooler nights to trigger flowering or fruiting start to fail. Some bolt prematurely, racing through their growth cycle as if in panic. Others never set fruit at all. The natural rhythms they relied on have vanished. Homes and offices fight the heat. Air conditioners switch from cycling on and off to running without a break. The power grid strains, wobbling on the edge of overload. People sleep restlessly if at all. Animals pace and whine. With no natural drop in light, the body never gets a clear cue to flood itself with sleep hormones. Nights become a matter of willpower and blackout curtains. Irritability spreads. Reaction times slow. Everyone is tired, and there is no real night to retreat into. As the sun holds its place higher and higher, temperatures keep climbing. Clouds thin as rising hot air disrupts their formation, leaving broad regions without shade. Lakes shrink, reservoirs drop, rivers slow. Urban areas, already hotter than their surroundings, become nearly unbearable. Whole districts turn into heat traps. People respond by retreating indoors or underground. Windows are covered in reflective films and layered curtains. Rooftops are painted white or coated with reflective membranes. Cooling centers, once seasonal resources, become year-round community lifelines, serving not just the elderly and sick, but entire neighborhoods that can't afford to keep their own spaces livable. Playgrounds empty out. Children are told to stay inside during most of the day, such as it's now defined. Schools stagger classes into what remains of the cooler hours, if those still exist, early in the cycle when temperatures dip a few degrees, or during artificially created nights indoors. And through it all, the sun just hangs in place. Agriculture, so tightly woven into day, night, and seasonal cycles, has to reinvent itself. Fields that used to thrive in open sunlight begin to fail. Soil dries out faster than irrigation can replenish it. Pests no longer retreat into cooler darkness. They feed and breed nonstop. Yields crater. In response, farming moves undercover. Vertical farms inside warehouses and towers. Hydroponic arrays stacked in old shipping containers. Controlled environment greenhouses with carefully tinted glass and automated shading. Timers and grow lights recreate lost day-night cycles on a small scale. Crops that once basked freely in the sun now rely on carefully rationed artificial light. Water usage spikes. People need more of it to stay cool. Plants require more to survive heat and evaporation. Livestock suffer. Dairy cows produce less milk. Heat-stressed animals eat less and put on weight more slowly. Some breeds cannot cope at all without significant technological support. Ranching shifts northward or collapses entirely in the hottest zones. And in the cities, architecture bends around the new reality. High-rises built for a world with regular nights become ovens. New buildings angle themselves away from the sun, with sloped facades, deep overhangs, and built-in reflective surfaces. The most desirable living spaces are no longer penthouses with broad windows, but deep, shaded interiors and subterranean homes where temperatures stay steadier. Above this underground life, the open world continues to bake. Roads ripple from heat. Blacktop deforms. Vehicle design changes. Reflective exteriors, enhanced cooling systems, new tire compounds that can handle softened pavement. Public transit in some cities begins operating primarily during the coolest portions of the cycle, those long, drawn-out twilights between the most intense phases of heat, which now last weeks instead of minutes. Clothing evolves towards survival gear. Light-colored fabrics, UV-resistant materials, hoods, face shields, and clothing with built-in cooling channels become standard streetwear. The cosmetic sunscreen of old beach days turns into long-acting, high SPF formulations that people wear just to commute. Pets adapt or struggle. Dogs go out for walks at odd hours when temperatures barely scrape into survivable ranges. Their paws need protection. Cats often aren't allowed outside at all. Wild animals vanish from daylight streets, retreating into burrows, caves, or the few remaining shady green pockets. Birdsong grows rare. Pollinating insects become scarce. Mornings, once noisy with life, grow eerily still. The wind shifts its behavior too. With rotation gone, global-scale circulation patterns weaken or disappear. Local winds still exist. Breezes driven by differences in temperature between land and water or between shaded and sunlit zones, but the big organizing structures of the atmosphere are fading. That leads to more stagnant air. Pollution hangs over urban centers, trapped by heat. Smog layers grow thicker and more persistent. Lungs suffer. Asthma and other respiratory ailments rise. Outdoor exercise becomes a health risk in many places, not just because of heat, but because the air itself is harsh. Wealthier regions use technology to buffer the blow. Air filtration, advanced cooling, hardened buildings, water recycling, climate-controlled transit. These soften the immediate impacts. Some people live in dense, sealed towers or underground complexes that resemble sci-fi habitats more than traditional cities. They work in spaces lit by artificial skies and cooled by machines, rarely spending time in unfiltered outdoor air. Elsewhere, the changes are brutal. Infrastructure breaks down, power grids overload, water systems falter. Rural communities see large-scale migration. People flock toward the half-livable twilight band or into better-resourced cities, already straining under their own challenges. Governments impose heat curfews, outlawing outdoor labor during the worst hours, which now might stretch into weeks. Some nations shift to heavily nocturnal economies, if night can still be defined at all. The very idea of time grows strange. People don't rely on sunrise and sunset to structure the day anymore. They begin measuring time by the angle of the sun, by the specific feel of the heat on their skin. New local time systems emerge. Instead of 8 a.m., someone might say, we'll meet when it drops below 35 degrees, or once the light fades to this color. Traditional holidays drift out of sync with the environment. Celebrations once held at dawn move indoors, decoupled from the sky. Rituals reliant on starlight are adapted to LED-lit ceilings and projections. The stories may remain. The setting has changed. Children grow up with no first-hand memory of spontaneous darkness. Night is something imposed by shutters, switch, or design. Bedtime becomes an agreement, not an event guided by nature. Kids draw pictures of suns that float in static skies, with no horizon line to dip behind. For some, that constant light becomes a symbol of endurance and human ingenuity. For others, it's a wound, a reminder of what was lost before they were born. At the edges, near the boundary where the day side transitions into the night side, there is still some real change. The sun isn't overhead there. It hovers lower, its intensity reduced. Temperature swings are milder. The faint suggestion of an old-style day-night cycle lingers, stretched over many weeks. People migrate there in great numbers. That narrow loop around the planet becomes prime real estate. Cities sprout along it, carefully designed to roll inch by inch as the slowly shifting line of twilight slides across the globe. Some of these urban zones are literally mobile clusters of buildings mounted on rails or heavy platforms that creep over land each year, keeping pace with the line between unbearable heat and lethal cold. They're called many things: horizon cities, line settlements, ring communities. Their inhabitants might be known as edge dwellers, twilight citizens, horizon chasers. They live at the front line of change, always repositioning but never leaving the margin between day and night. Some choose to follow the leading edge of sunlight. Others track the fading tail. For most people, though, such movement is impossible or unimaginable. They stay. They carve out a life wherever they are, under the endless sun or inside the never-ending dark. They learn to sleep under bright skies or wake in deep blackness. They gather. They argue. They grieve. They celebrate. Because even in a world where the sun never sets, people still invent routines. They still form communities. They still find ways to make rhythm where none is handed to them. The sun is powerful, but it doesn't tell stories. We do. And while half the globe endures relentless noon, the other half deals with the opposite. A darkness not of brief night, but of an entire season, or many, that refuses to lift. The sun hasn't vanished. The world just no longer turns to face it. On the dark half of the planet, night doesn't arrive the way it used to. It doesn't slide in gradually as the sun dips past the horizon. It doesn't bring that gentle cool down of late evening, or the familiar soundtrack of nocturnal life stirring to replace the day. It doesn't carry the quiet promise that morning will follow. Here, night comes once, and then it stays. The endless night doesn't begin in chaos. It begins in confusion. At first, people assume it's weather, a thick storm front, smoke from distant volcanic eruptions, some unusual eclipse. The streetlights flick on. Businesses keep hours as usual. Flights depart and arrive. People go to bed expecting things to look different tomorrow. Tomorrow looks the same. The second day passes. The third. A week. No sunrise. No hint of glow behind the clouds. Whatever this is, it's not passing. At first, the impulse is to carry on. Lights get brighter, workdays stay the same. Coffee shops open on schedule. Traffic flows beneath a perpetual canopy of black. Hardware stores sell out of bulbs, lanterns, flashlights. Backup generators become prized. There's a run on fuel. Candles return to windowsills. The mood is tense, but not panicked. It's only darkness, people say. We can handle darkness. We still have power. The world isn't shaking. Then the temperature drops. Without the sun's constant input, the ground begins to leak heat back into space. Not instantly. Thermal inertia buys a little time. Oceans and deep rock hold warmth for a while. Cities perched over power plants and industrial infrastructure feel the cold last. But the general direction is downward. Within weeks, overnight lows sink below freezing for most regions. Within a few months, those lows become the baseline. Lakes skin over with ice. Shallow rivers slow, then harden. Soil that once turned easily under a shovel becomes rigid and brittle. Buildings creak. Window frames warp. Doors jam in their casings as the materials contract. Breath fogs indoors as well as out. People respond the way they always have, by clustering and conserving. Extra blankets appear on every bed. Sweaters layer over sweaters. Gloves and scarves migrate from closets into everyday life. Families close off entire sections of their homes, sealing vents and gaps, heating only 1 or 2 rooms. Old houses built for milder climates suffer the most. Poorly insulated walls bleed warmth straight into the night. Pipes freeze and burst. Roofs sag under unexpected snow accumulations. Some residents give up on trying to heat their whole home and move into basements or interior rooms, improvising micro-shelters within their own space tents pitched over mattresses, furniture rearranged around one working heater. Outdoor plants die quickly. Lawns brown and vanish beneath frost. Gardens collapse. Houseplants drop leaves, then stems. Without sunlight, photosynthesis halts. Stored sugars run out, cells break down. Food stowed in root cellars and unheated storage begins to freeze rock solid. Crops left in fields are lost. Farmers know, looking out across frozen soil, that nothing will be planted there again for a long time, if ever. Wildlife changes behavior, then begins to disappear. Day-active animals retreat. Some wander, confused, looking for warmth and light that no longer exist. Many don't make it. Predators accustomed to hunting by sight struggle. Prey animals cannot forage in the same patterns. Insects, critical to so many food webs, crash. Their short life cycles can't ride out a sunless freeze. The soundscape changes. Crickets vanish. Songbirds go silent. The rustle of small creatures in underbrush is replaced by stillness. Time, too, begins to feel strange. Without sunrise or sunset, the border between one day and the next blurs. People set alarms. Phones and clocks remain accurate, their seconds and minutes marching on. But internally, the sense of what Tuesday means erodes. People misjudge how long they've been awake. Naps expand into unintended marathons. Sleeplessness lingers into hazy, overstimulated states. Daily life reorganizes around routines rather than daylight. Morning becomes whatever you do after your longest sleep. Evening is the span after your main work and before your longest rest, regardless of the clock reading. Families create rotating duty lists. Who keeps the fire going, who checks fuel reserves, who tends neighbors, who monitors radio or network updates. Community spaces change roles. Schools, churches, libraries, recreation centers, they stop being just institutions and become warming stations, food distribution hubs, mental health anchors. People who might never have set foot inside these buildings before now rely on them for shared heat and human presence. The mental toll deepens with the cold. Lack of natural light is more than an inconvenience. It's a biochemical disruption. Mood-regulating systems in the brain falter. Some people become numb and withdrawn. Others become sharply anxious or irritable. Small irritations stretch into days-long rifts. Relationships strain under the weight of constant closeness, constant stress, and the low-grade confusion of a world with no sunrise. In regions with resources and foresight, public health systems pivot. Counseling services expand. Light therapy rooms appear in hospitals, offices, and community centers. Spectrally calibrated lamps simulate daylight in carefully dosed sessions. Virtual landscapes become popular VR programs that mimic sunny forests, beaches, or city streets at golden hour. People find comfort not just in simulated brightness, but in the illusion of motion shadows that actually move, reflections that shift. In poorer or less prepared regions, adaptation is harsher. Without reliable power and heating, many buildings become uninhabitable. People crowd into whatever structures can be kept warm. Even parking garages converted into shelter grids, warehouse floors lined with cots, subway tunnels given over to long-term occupancy. Rural homes far from centralized infrastructure are sometimes abandoned altogether. Towns consolidate or empty out. Eventually, food becomes a more urgent problem than heat. On the dark side, open-air agriculture is no longer viable. Farming moves entirely indoors. High-efficiency LEDs replace the sun. Hydroponic systems feed rows of leafy greens, root crops, and fast-growing vegetables. Vertical layers of trays maximize production in limited footprints. But artificial light and climate control require energy. A lot of it. Regions without strong, resilient grids or abundant energy sources watch yields collapse. Some rely heavily on imported food from the sunlit half of the planet. Others try to improvise ultra-low energy systems, mushroom cultivation in cool basements, insect farms, algae operations that can tolerate marginal conditions. Livestock farming shrinks dramatically. Chickens need light cues to lay eggs. Cows burn more calories to keep warm and produce less milk. Pigs struggle in extreme cold. Feed supplies dwindle. In many places, meat becomes more of a luxury or is supplemented and gradually replaced by lab-grown alternatives in plant or microbe-based proteins. Supply chains, once optimized for speed and efficiency, struggle in the new reality. Shipping lanes, ice over. Icebreakers can't keep all routes open. Aviation faces increased risks from turbulent atmospheric layers, unpredictable storms, and higher radiation exposure, especially as the magnetic field weakens. Freight that used to arrive reliably in days now takes weeks, or never arrives at all. Governments respond with rationing plans. Staple foods are prioritized, non-essential imports drop off. Greenhouse space is reserved for calorie-dense crops. Community gardens move indoors where possible. Urban farms spring up under parking structures, in abandoned office buildings, anywhere there's enough space to rig up lights, pumps, and nutrient tanks. Education continues, but its framework changes. Many schools move partially or fully online, not because of a virus or war, but because commuting in unstable weather and perpetual darkness is risky and draining. Children attend classes on screens lit to mimic bright daytime. Their textbooks show blue skies, sunshine, and parks that they may have never known. Teachers explain concepts like sunrise, not as daily facts, but as things that used to happen. Kids learn about the sun as an idea, a scientific object, more than a personal experience. Their own cycles revolve around artificial cues, lights on at morning, scheduled play hours under full-spectrum lamps, bedtime stories in warm-lit rooms far from any window that ever brightens. Their vitamin D comes not from time outdoors, but from drops, pills, or fortified foods. Entire generations grow up under this long night. For them, darkness is not frightening by default. It's normal. They measure the world in terms of warmth and cold, light and dimness, not in day and night. Their stories feature embers, lamps, and screens, not sunsets. Spiritual and cultural traditions reconfigure themselves. Some faiths interpret the endless night as trial, punishment, or prophecy. Others view it as a new era, a test of solidarity and compassion. New observances form around the appearance of light ceremonies where entire neighborhoods dim their artificial illumination and then slowly bring it back up to simulate sunrise. Festivals that once honored solstices shift to celebrate technological dawns, the turning on of a new power plant, the expansion of a greenhouse network, the lighting of a new communal square. Artists respond in their own languages. Painters work with layered artificial light, trying to recreate the subtleties of dawn and dusk using LEDs and projections. Musicians write pieces that echo the slow, heavy tempo of a world without visual time markers. Writers turn inward, exploring memory, interior landscapes, and the strange elasticity of time when the sky offers no reference. Nostalgia becomes a powerful current. People pass down stories of summer evenings and bright winter mornings like precious heirlooms. Photographs of sunlit beaches or tree-lined streets at golden hour take on almost sacred importance. For those who remember, the sense of loss is sharp. For those born into the dark, these images look almost fantastical. And then, at last, something changes. It begins as a rumor. Somewhere near the horizon, someone notices the blackness thinning. A soft gray band, barely distinguishable from cloud, forms low in the sky. It's easy to dismiss it as imagination at first, a trick of contrast or city glow. But day after day, the faint brightness grows stronger, stretching a little higher. The first true light, when it comes, is fragile and diffuse. It has to fight its way through layers of cold, dense air and ice crystals, but eventually it's strong enough to cast shadows. People cry when they see them. Children who have never seen their own silhouettes watch, fascinated, as dark shapes appear on the ground behind them. Adults stand outside in silence, faces wet, not from pain, but from the weight of change. Animals emerge from dens, caves, and burrows, blinking and pawing at the light. Birds that survived by staying hidden test the air with tentative calls. Over weeks, the sun itself appears, first as a faint glow, then as a defined edge. It crawls upward. The darkness finally begins to give way. On the opposite side of the globe, the story flips. The unending day begins, very slowly, to cool. The sun, which hovered high and brutal, starts drifting toward the horizon. The light softens. The heat eases. For them, this shift is as profound as first light is for the night side. The long noon is ending. A drawn-out, merciful dusk has begun. As the line between day and night, once fixed for months on end, starts to slide again, another force wakes up. Not the light itself, but the air. Because when you start putting warmth back into frozen regions and letting overheated areas shed their heat, the atmosphere doesn't respond politely. It surges. When you think of wind, you probably imagine something modest. A soft breeze brushing your face, rustling leaves, making street signs tremble. Even a bad storm howling gusts, slamming doors, flying branches, is still within the bounds of your experience. Wind, at its essence, is just air, trying to even out pressure differences. But when the processes that once guided those differences break down, what comes next doesn't follow the comfortable rules you grew up with. Earth's spin didn't just split day from night, it helped organize the entire atmosphere. As the ground rotated, the air tried to keep up, lagging just enough to produce complex patterns, jet streams whipping around the globe, trade winds carving steady paths, cyclones twisting into spirals. The Coriolis effect, born from that spin, bent straight-line motions into curved tracks, giving our weather its shapes and limits. Remove the rotation, and that framework collapses. At first, momentum keeps some of the old structures alive. Air doesn't slam to a stop any more than the oceans do. But without continuous rotational input, the neat rivers of high-altitude wind begin to lose coherence. Jet streams thin out and fragment. Cyclonic systems lose their familiar spin. Storm patterns linger or stall. Then, the deeper imbalance asserts itself. On the perpetual day side, the ground soaks up more and more solar energy. Air near the surface heats, expands, and rises in immense convection columns. That hot air, once it rises, needs to be replaced. On the night side, air cools, sinks, and densifies. That cold, heavy air wants somewhere to go, so it moves. The result is a giant, world-spanning circulation. Hot air rising on the day side, cold air surging in from the night side to replace it. At the boundary regions, the twilight belt between scorching and frozen, the wind accelerates. What begins as a steady flow intensifies into something closer to a planetary conveyor of air. This isn't a storm system blowing through for a weekend. It's constant, directional wind on a scale we've never seen. In those boundary regions, where previously there might have been gentle breezes and rotating storms, the air now roars. Speeds climb into the tens, then hundreds of kilometers per hour, and keep going. This is the atmosphere's answer to a world that no longer spins. A brutal attempt to even out temperature and pressure between eternal day and eternal night. Infrastructure along that line takes a beating. Buildings that were engineered for the strongest historical storms, hurricanes, typhoons, derechos now face continuous wind at comparable or greater speeds. Fatigue sets in. Materials crack, supports bend, windows implode from sheer pressure, power lines snap. Anything that isn't firmly anchored becomes a projectile. Light poles, road signs, unsecured vehicles, entire roofs. Forests in the twilight band begin to lean permanently, sculpted by the prevailing flow. Trees not adapted to such stress topple. Soil blows away. Fertile ground turns to dust and then to airborne grit, carried across continents. Old riverbeds, now dry from climate shifts, release long-buried sediments into the sky. In some places, that dust contains salt left behind by evaporated seas, carried inland to whiten fields and corrode buildings. In others, it's fine topsoil, stripped from once productive land and scattered. Desertification, already a problem in our spinning world, jumps into fast forward. Air travel becomes nearly impossible through these corridors. Turbulence is not a patchy nuisance, it's the default. Planes can't rely on predictable jet streams or safe cruising altitudes. Many airports within or near the worst bands shut down entirely. The oceans respond as well. Persistent high winds drive enormous fetch lengths long distances over which wind blows across open water, allowing waves to grow taller and more violent. Coasts that were never prone to tsunamis now face other kinds of devastation. Unrelenting wind-driven storm surges, massive waves driven inland again and again, gradually eroding and drowning defenses. On the day side, those rising convection towers turn into towering storm structures that refuse to travel. Instead of a thunderstorm blowing in for an hour and then clearing, you get towering columns of cloud that just hang in the same place, dumping rain, hail, and lightning for days at a time. Flooding becomes chronic. Lightning becomes a background feature of the sky. On the night side, something similar happens, but inverted. Cold, high-altitude air plunges downward in powerful downdrafts, particularly along mountain slopes and into valleys. These invisible avalanches of air can strip forests, topple structures, and scour landscapes. They're not discrete gusts, they're sustained flows, roaring through canyons and across plains. Where dayside updrafts and nightside downdrafts meet along that twilight belt, the atmosphere turns into a grinding machine. A nearly unbroken ring of hurricane-class winds may circle the planet, fed by the relentless contrast between hot and cold. Living there becomes nearly impossible above ground. Some communities retreat beneath the surface. Old mine systems, subway tunnels, and purpose-dug shelters are expanded into entire subterranean districts. Entryways are built like airlocks with pressure seals and heavily reinforced doors. Air handling systems run non-stop, filtering dust and debris, regulating internal climates and diffusing pressure changes from the outside. Technology reshapes itself to these new conditions. Wind turbines are redesigned, not to spin faster, but to endure. Massive, slow-turning blades and deeply anchored foundations capture energy from the non-stop gale. Electricity in these regions becomes abundant but dangerous to maintain. Solar power is more practical on the calmer dayside interior, while wind dominates the edge. Transportation networks move underground where they can. Surface roads fall apart or become too risky to use for anything but emergency or heavily armored vehicles. Short-range, heavily shielded transit pods connect underground hubs designed to withstand abrupt pressure changes and flying debris. Culturally, people begin to talk about wind the way we once talked about storms or seasons. They give it names, describe its moods, its tones. They learn to interpret the pitch of its howl as it rushes past walls, the shaking of vents, the tremor in the ground as gusts pass overhead. Weather alerts become wind alerts, not just how fast it's blowing, but how dense the air is, how laden with grit or ice, how violently it's likely to shift in the next hour. Art absorbs this noise. Musicians record the voices of the wind outside their shelters low, droning roars or high, keening whistles and weave them into songs. Sculptors polish stone and metal surfaces that have been etched by years of abrasive air, turning erosion patterns into gallery pieces. Architects craft buildings that move slightly with the gusts, flexing instead of resisting. Even indoors, the presence of wind is felt. The faint, constant hum of filtration fans, the distant moan of air finding tiny imperfections in seals, the occasional jolt when an external panel gives a bit under pressure, all remind you that outside, the atmosphere is in full, restless motion. Despite the danger, some people still go out into it. Engineers and technicians have to. So do certain farmers, researchers, and couriers. They step outside in specialized suits, pressurized, armored, weighted to keep them stable in strong gusts. Helmets shield eyes and ears. Exoskeletons redistribute force. They come back with stories of a world reshaped, trees bent nearly horizontal, rock faces scoured smooth on one side and serrated on the other, dunes marching at impossible speeds. They talk about moments when the sky briefly opens, a pocket of eerie calm between roars, and the silence is so complete, it's unnerving. They talk about how, even in the chaos, patterns emerge. Pulses, cycles, larger rhythms that you would never notice unless you stood in it, listened, and endured. Then they return inside. Hatches close. Pressure equalizes. The filtered hum replaces the outside roar. The wind, though, doesn't stop. It will only ease when the fundamental imbalance between searing day and frozen night starts to soften, when heat has redistributed as much as it can, when the planet finds a new kind of equilibrium, or when some other force changes the rules again. But the atmosphere isn't the only system responding. While wind scrapes at the land and sky, the oceans have been shifting all along, and water, with its sheer mass and patience, brings a very different kind of movement. The oceans are the heaviest moving bodies on Earth's surface. They carry more momentum than the fiercest winds, more shifting mass than any mountain chain, and they are not easily persuaded to stop. Covering more than 70% of the globe, they respond directly to any planetary scale change, especially one as profound as the loss of rotation. When the rules change, the oceans don't just stay put, they adjust. And once they start adjusting, they take a very long time to finish. On a spinning Earth, gravity isn't the only force acting on seawater. There's also the outward tug of centrifugal force, strongest at the equator. Over billions of years, that tug has piled water slightly higher around the planet's midsection, creating what's called the equatorial bulge, an enormous subtle swell over 8-kilometer high when measured center to surface. You can't see it from the beach, but it's there, a quiet rearrangement of the seas held in place by rotation. Turn off the spin, and that outward pull disappears. Slowly or violently, depending on how our thought experiment plays out, the oceans start to flow downhill, away from the equator, and toward the poles. If the change is abrupt, the consequences are immediate and brutal. Sea levels around the tropics would fall as water drains away. Vast stretches of current seafloor reefs, continental shelves, old submerged river channels would rise into the air. Tropical coastlines would march seaward as harbors and deltas run dry. Coral reefs, suddenly exposed, would bleach and die in the sun, becoming chalk-white scars on the new land. Shipping routes that once crossed deep blue water would become impassable fields of rock and sand. At the same time, water would pile into the higher latitudes. Polar and near-polar regions would see the sea climb relentlessly. Places like northern Canada, Scandinavia, Siberia, Greenland, and Antarctica would watch as their shorelines advance inland, first by meters, then by kilometers, then by hundreds of kilometers in some areas. Coastal cities thought safe for centuries would find themselves waist-deep, then completely buried, not by storm surges, but by a slow, permanent rise. If the process is gradual unfolding over generations instead of months, the effect would still be astonishing, just less cinematic. It would feel like a tide that never turns. Every year, maps would need redrawing. Old ports would be abandoned, new ones built farther inland or on higher ground. Some countries would lose enormous chunks of territory. Others would gain shallow seas where plains once were. Water doesn't move in a single smooth pore either. It looks for the easiest pathways, filling basins, pushing along river channels, spilling over low divides. Major river systems would reverse in places as ocean water intrudes upriver. The Mississippi could see salt water creeping deep into the continent. Parts of the Amazon basin might become a vast, warm inland sea. Islands and archipelagos would merge into new landmasses in the tropics, while formerly solid stretches of land near the poles fragment into networks of bays, fjords, and drowned valleys. And then there's temperature. On the day side, constant sunlight would superheat surface waters. Evaporation would accelerate. Seas would give up their moisture to the air in staggering volumes. Clouds would form. But remember, without rotation to move them coherently, they might gather and linger over some areas while leaving others bare. Some coastal regions would experience frequent, even constant torrential rain, while others sit under empty sky with humid air that refuses to condense. As water evaporates, salinity rises. Warm water leaves, salt stays. Marine life finely tuned to narrow salinity ranges would struggle. Many species would migrate toward deeper, cooler, more stable waters. Fisheries that once thrived in certain coastal zones would begin to fail, not just from heat, but from the shifting chemical balance of the seas. On the night side, the process inverts. Surface water cools and eventually begins to freeze. First come thin sheets of ice in sheltered coves, then thicker, interlocking slabs. Given enough time in darkness, and without warm currents delivered by a functioning global circulation, ice could spread across entire oceans at higher latitudes. Ports become useless as ice locks ships in place or crushes hulls. Shipping lanes choke and then vanish. Harbors once free of sea ice now resemble polar expedition footage. Frozen jumbles of broken flows with water barely visible beneath. Infrastructure built on the assumption that water stays liquid most of the year would fail under expansion and pressure. Under that ice, though, the ocean still tries to move. Currents, once driven by a mix of wind, temperature, and salinity differences, start to weaken. Without rotation, the great gyres that spin in each major ocean basin can't maintain their structure. The global conveyor belt that moves warm surface water poleward and returns cold, dense water to the depths would falter. As the tropics lose their equatorial bulge and the poles gain water and ice, the entire pattern of temperature and salinity differences changes. In many regions, surface waters would become more uniform colder and fresher near melting ice, hotter and saltier under constant sun. These flatter gradients rob the system of some of the energy that drives circulation. Key currents like the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation part of what keeps northern Europe milder than its latitude suggests could sputter out. Without that highway of warm water flowing north, regions on the dark or twilight side that once enjoyed temperate climates would turn sharply colder. Stagnant surface waters have a harder time exchanging gases with the atmosphere. Oxygen levels could drop, especially in warmer, saltier seas. Dead zones would spread regions where little or no oxygen remains, and most higher life cannot survive. Coastal upwelling which brings nutrient-rich deep water to the surface to fuel rich ecosystems, might cease in many places. The biological fallout would be huge. Fish species that spawn in specific temperature bands would lose their cues. Coral reefs, already stressed, would collapse in both too hot and too unstable waters. Complex food webs would simplify. You might see explosive growth of opportunistic organisms, certain jellyfish, algae, bacteria, while more delicate or specialized species disappear. On the twilight edge, where the global scale winds are raging, the ocean surface would be a violent mess. Persistent, howling winds would drive enormous confused seas. Waves from different directions would stack on top of one another. So-called rogue waves, sudden towering walls of water that already occur in our world, would become more frequent and possibly larger, not rare monsters, but regular hazards. Human seafaring would adapt or retreat. Traditional ships would struggle to survive. Autonomous, heavily reinforced drones and submersibles might handle most open ocean data gathering and cargo movement, dipping below the worst of the surface chaos. Human crews would stick to more sheltered routes or give up on certain parts of the ocean altogether. Back on land, people would be forced into a constant state of adaptation as coastlines march and curl into new forms. Floodplains appear where none existed. Saltwater intrudes into aquifers, poisoning wells miles inland. Farmland that relied on predictable freshwater flow from rivers becomes too salty or too waterlogged to use. Freshwater turns into a currency, something stored, traded, controlled. Cities in mid-latitudes might experiment with amphibious design. Floating neighborhoods that rise and fall with local water levels, stilt-based architecture with adjustable heights, modular foundations that can be repositioned as shorelines migrate. Other regions would simply abandon the fight, leaving behind drowned suburbs, ghostly piers, and half-collapsed seawalls facing seas that keep on rising slowly north and south. In some places, people will stand at new shores that were mountainsides or inland valleys just a few generations ago, watching an unfamiliar sea heave under a sky frozen in late afternoon or early dusk. Psychologically, our relationship with the ocean would change. Beaches, once places of leisure and predictability, tide in, tide out, wave after wave, become zones of instability and grief. People still visit, but with a sharper awareness that the line between land and water is no longer dependable. Children raised in this new world would learn a different catalog of ocean stories. Instead of tales about storms that blow through and tides that return, they'd hear about currents that went still, coasts that vanished, fisheries that migrated or collapsed, ice that crept steadily outward. Science would lean in hard. Oceanography, climatology, cryosphere studies, they'd receive new urgency and funding. Deep-sea research platforms, permanent under-ice stations, and mobile ocean observatories would become central not just to understanding the planet, but to planning how and where people can live. And even amid the chaos, the ocean would still harbor wonders. Bioluminescent organisms glowing under ever-thickening ice, microbial communities clustered around hydrothermal vents deep below frozen surfaces, strange new species thriving in slow, dark waters that are no longer stirred. Some corners of the deep sea would barely notice the change above, their strange, high-pressure world continuing on its own odd timeline. The oceans would not be dead. They would be transformed. Their surfaces louder, their depths quieter, their edges redrawn. And as this water weight shifts, migrating from equator to poles, the planet itself feels the strain. Rock, after all, can bend, and under enough pressure, it will. Gravity is one of those background conditions you rarely question until it changes. It's the constant tug that keeps your feet on the floor, pulls a dropped glass to the ground, and shapes your muscles and bones over a lifetime. It holds water in basins, anchors the atmosphere, keeps satellites orbiting instead of flying straight into the void. Even gravity, constant as it seems, is part of a dynamic system. On a spinning Earth, centrifugal force, though weaker than gravity, slightly counters its pull at the equator. That's why you technically weigh a tiny bit less there than at the poles. It's a small difference, only a fraction of a percent, invisible without precise instruments, but it exists. If the Earth's rotation stops, that opposing force disappears. Gravity doesn't get stronger in an absolute sense, but with nothing to offset it, you feel its full effect. It's a subtle shift on the order of 0.3%. Someone weighing 70 kilograms would now register about 70.2. Not enough to crush anyone, but enough that over long days and heavy work, the increased weight would make itself known in aching joints, in slightly slower jumps, in sports records that plateau instead of being broken. The bigger story is in the shape of the planet. Earth is not a perfect sphere. It's slightly flattened at the poles and bulged at the equator and oblate spheroid. That bulge comes from rotation. The outward push of centrifugal force has been very gently redistributing mass outward at the waistline for eons. Take away the spin, and the planet starts to relax. Very slowly, over thousands of years, it begins to move toward a more spherical form. The equatorial regions, no longer pushed outward, would start to sink inward. The polar regions, relieved of some gravitational imbalance, might rise a little. You wouldn't see mountains suddenly collapsing or continents dramatically folding, but sensitive instruments would detect millimeter-scale changes year after year. Satellites tracking Earth's gravity field would show its subtle rebalancing. As the solid Earth deforms, so does everything above it. Ocean water, already migrating toward the poles due to the loss of the equatorial bulge, adds its own weight to the high latitudes. The crust there bows downward under the new burden. Equatorial land, freed from both the water and some of the bulge, begins to rebound upward. This isn't theoretical. We see a smaller scale version today where glaciers have melted. In places like Scandinavia and parts of Canada, the land is still rising centimeters per decade as it recovers from the weight of ancient ice sheets. With a stopped Earth, this isostatic rebound becomes global and more intense. The result is a planet that is quietly warping. Shorelines keep shifting not just because of the horizontal movement of water, but because the land itself is rising or falling. A coastal city might find its docks becoming useless because the harbor has become too shallow, or because the land they're built on is steadily sinking. Stress builds in the crust. Old faults, cracks in the rock that haven't moved in recorded history may suddenly come back to life. Regions long considered seismically quiet could start experiencing quakes. Existing quake-prone zones might see changes in frequency or strength as the stress patterns reorganize. Volcanoes respond too. Pressure changes in the crust can destabilize magma chambers. Some dormant volcanoes might become active again, releasing lava, ash, and gas into a sky that's already been altered by other forces. New volcanic vents could open in regions unprepared for them. Glaciers and ice sheets get in on this feedback loop. On the permanent night side, and much of the twilight and polar regions, temperatures would allow vast new ice accumulations. Over time, colossal glacial blankets could form, as moisture from the day side gets carried and eventually deposited, then compacted. These titanic ice masses exert their own crushing weight on the crust, forcing it downward even more. Elsewhere, especially on the relentless day, side-existing ice would melt quickly. Mountain glaciers, Arctic and subarctic ice, any remaining seasonal snowpacks, they'd shrink, then disappear. Land under those former ice loads would begin to rebound upward, changing river gradients, cutting new pathways for water, altering drainage basins. Across the planet, the net effect is that elevation maps become moving targets. What used to be a stable height above sea level becomes a shifting metric. Engineers can no longer assume that the ground beneath a bridge pier or dam will stay at the same relative height for centuries. Foundations need to be adaptable. Some large structures are built with adjustable bases that can be raised, lowered, or shifted laterally as the land warps. Even deep beneath the crust, in the molten outer core where the geodynamo lives, these changes matter. The motion of the liquid iron is influenced ever so slightly by how mass is distributed above it. As the oceans drain toward the poles and land rebounds or sags, that balance shifts. Flow patterns in the core can alter in response. The magnetic field, already vulnerable due to the loss or reduction of spin, becomes even less stable. Magnetic north drifts faster and more erratically. Regions that once had reliable compass readings might find their needles swinging or wandering over years. Some areas may temporarily experience weird local reversals or patches of chaotic field behavior. Navigation systems adapt. Pilots, sailors, and hikers can't trust simple compasses. Everything relies more heavily on satellites and inertial systems, assuming those satellites are still functional in a radiation-battered near-Earth space. As the overall field weakens, more high-energy particles from the sun and space penetrate down toward the atmosphere and surface. Electronics become more vulnerable to single-event upsets, tiny glitches caused by particles flipping a bit in a processor or memory chip. Over long periods, increased radiation exposure could push up certain cancer risks, particularly in equatorial zones where, in our world, the field shielding was once strongest. To counter this, buildings in many regions adopt radiation mitigating materials, specialized concrete mixes, internal shielding layers, radiation dispersing paints. Sensitive equipment is kept in hardened vaults. Wearable devices alert users to spikes in ambient radiation, especially during solar storms. Space agencies rewrite mission protocols. Launch windows are planned not only around weather and orbital mechanics, but also around solar activity and a less protective magnetosphere. Astronauts and pilots follow new exposure guidelines. And through all this slow chaos, everyday life keeps finding ways to continue. People might begin to think of places not just in terms of climate, language, or culture, but also in gravitational feel. Some areas where the crust has risen, or where centrifugal relief was once greatest, might now have slightly lower or higher effective gravity compared to others. It's not like moving to a different planet, but the cumulative effect over years could influence athletics, health, even architecture. Niche tourism industries might spring up around these subtle differences. Want to feel just a tiny bit lighter or heavier? Travel here. Museums build exhibits that simulate the slight weight variation, letting visitors feel the difference created by a non-spinning Earth's redistribution of mass. Amusement parks design new attractions that exploit local gravitational quirks and illusions. Artists and writers fold these ideas into metaphors. Stories are told about people moving between heavy and light regions and how it changes them physically and emotionally. Songs and poems explore the sense of increased weight as a symbol for the emotional gravity of a stopped world. All the while, the crust continues its slow, grinding negotiation with gravity. The planet never truly comes to rest. It just seeks a different balance. Each subtle rise or fall of rock, each rebound or sag, ripples upward into our cities and fields, our maps and machines. Gravity, that quiet constant, doesn't let go, and neither does change. But while the planet's mass rearranges itself under our feet, another transformation is going on that's easier to see, but harder to mentally grasp. The way place itself starts to blur. Because once the spin is gone, the locations we think of as home aren't where or what they used to be. The equator used to be in a hurry. You couldn't see it in the trees or feel it under your shoes, but if you stood anywhere along that wide belt, you were moving faster than anyone else on the planet, more than 1/600 kilometers h every second of your life, faster than sound without the slightest sensation of speed. That motion lived in everything, in the sun's steep, direct path overhead, in the dependable length of day and night, in the shape of global wind patterns and cloud belts. The equator wasn't just a line on a map, it was a condition. It was the region where the sun could pass straight overhead at least twice a year, where daylight and darkness split the day almost equally, where climate, for all its storms, had a certain balance. It was where towering tropical clouds rose with the afternoon heat, poured out rain, then drifted away. Where dense jungles, wet soils, and warm currents defined how life unfolded. Take away the spin, and all of that starts to slip. Without rotation, the equator stops being a special engine of circulation. The sun no longer marches across the sky. In some parts of the world, the equator falls under the eternal day side, trapped in continuous light at a fixed angle. In others, it lies buried in the permanently dark hemisphere. Instead of being a band of balance, It becomes either a zone of relentless heat or unbroken chill. Temperatures and wind patterns that once made the equator a global driver of weather begin to fall apart. On the sun-facing sections of the equator, the land bakes. There's no nightly cool-down, no regular lull. Air heats and rises, but without rotation to spread that lift into neat circulation cells, the old Hadley cells that once carried heat poleward begin to collapse. Air still moves, but not in the organized bands we're used to. Instead, the equator on the day side becomes a massive stagnant heat reservoir. The ground radiates energy into the air. The air rises over and over, right where it is. Moisture evaporates from oceans and forests, forming clouds that build straight upward and then burst. Rain might arrive in violent, irregular pulses instead of daily patterns, pounding the same areas repeatedly while leaving others strangely dry. Humidity climbs to suffocating levels. Mold becomes a major enemy. Buildings sweat from the inside. Electronics corrode faster. Clothes never fully dry. Diseases favored by warmth and moisture, fungal infections. Certain parasites, mosquito-borne illnesses if mosquitoes can still thrive there. Find fertile ground. Farming in these equatorial heat zones becomes a battle against extremes. Too much water at once, too much heat all the time, too little predictability. Classic crops fail. Farmers experiment with heat-tolerant varieties, shade structures, and partially enclosed systems. But every adaptation is working against a sky that no longer offers pause. On the dark side stretches of the equator, the change is even more shocking. By definition, the equator was always warm sun close to overhead, days and nights balanced, seasons mild. Now it becomes a place of cold. No sunlight, no daily heating cycle, nothing to keep temperatures from sliding downward month after month. Rainforests that once pulsed with near constant life begin to die back. Canopies thin, then break. Trees adapted to high humidity and stable warmth cannot handle deep freezes. Leaves blacken and fall. Trunks crack. Entire forests go quiet, then skeletal. Vines become brittle cords. Rivers like the Amazon and Congo slow and partially freeze, especially in tributaries and shallower stretches. Wetlands harden. Amphibians vanish. Birds that used to follow the equatorial sun lose their cues and either flee aimlessly or perish in place. Coastal equatorial waters, once among the warmest and richest, cool down dramatically. Coral reefs, already devastated by earlier warming, now face the opposite problem, or more accurately, a compounding one. Many would already be dead from temperature and chemistry stress. Whatever remained would not survive prolonged cold and unstable conditions. Fishing villages that depended on predictable seasonal upwelling and teeming near-shore life would find only emptier, colder seas. Meanwhile, as Earth reshapes under the loss of its bulge, the very idea of equator as we knew it weakens. The line on the globe remains as a geometric definition, 0-degree latitude, but its physical meaning has slipped. No extra outward push, no special spin-driven weather. Just another set of coordinates on a planet that's trying to become more spherical. Because the equatorial bulge is shrinking, land along the old equator begins to lift relative to the planet's center. Even small changes in radius translate into noticeable changes in elevation when measured over large regions. Coastlines that once hugged the sea might find themselves perched on rising plateaus. Shallow equatorial bays could retreat. Coral atolls might become high, dry limestone ridges. Ecosystems move with the land, not by walking, but by being relocated in altitude and climate. Lowland rainforests slowly turn into something more like highland scrublands or dry plateaus, if life can hang on at all under new light conditions. Species that once occupied mountainsides move further up or run out of mountain. Plains fauna find themselves in terrain that no longer matches their adaptations. Human settlements built on the assumption of forever tropics face a rude awakening. Building styles, water systems, even city layouts had been shaped around predictable heat, rain, and sunlight. Now some equatorial cities sit in scorching regions with unstable storm cycles and brutal humidity. Others freeze under dark skies, their architecture completely unsuited for deep cold. Cultural identities tied to the equator shift as well. Many equatorial societies have rich traditions wrapped around the regularity of day length and the passage of the sun directly overhead, rituals on equinoxes, ceremonies for zenith noons, festivals timed to seasonal rain patterns. Those natural touchstones vanish. Without the sun's motion to anchor them, some traditions become purely symbolic. People might continue to celebrate an equinox according to a fixed calendar date, even though the sky no longer behaves any differently that day. Other rituals are adapted, held indoors under artificial lighting that mimics the old sun path, or shifted to align with the slow annual rise and fall of the star in the new one-year day. Language changes. Words that once described short twilights, sudden downpours, or the thick, humid air before an afternoon storm may fall out of daily use. New words emerge for the constant glare, the weeks-long rain events, the months of unbroken darkness. Farmers talk less about rainy seasons and more about flood cycles or dry stretches, detached from the precise calendar timings that used to guide them. In some places, equatorial cities respond with massive infrastructure. Enormous climate-controlled domes, entire neighborhoods enclosed under translucent canopies, regulate their own sunlight and rainfall. Inside, computer-controlled systems dim and brighten, spritz and dry, trying to recapture a version of the old tropics on a smaller scale. Children in those domes might grow up knowing rain as something scheduled. Elsewhere, the changes are more improvisational. Awnings stretched over narrow streets, communal misting systems in heat-scorched zones, makeshift greenhouses, and insulated shelters in the cold ones. Aid organizations send not just food and medicine, but blueprints for adaptable housing, seeds for stress-tolerant crops, cheap sensors for monitoring soil moisture and temperature. Many people leave. Migration from equatorial bands intensifies as resources dwindle or conditions become unlivable. Flows of climate refugees that once moved primarily north-south now also track the twilight band, seeking that narrow strip of moderate, if stormy, conditions. Nations once considered equatorial powers might watch their populations disperse and their centers of gravity, economic, cultural, and literal shift away. Some communities stay, not because it's easy, but because that's where their history lies. They relearn how to live with a sky that doesn't move. They study the new patterns of rain, haze, wind, or frost. They plant what grows. They build shade where it's needed and traps warmth where it's lost. They invent local calendars based not on an absent rotation, but on whatever cycles still exist. The timing of storms, the phases of a long-year sun, the slow, predictable arrival of migrating animals that have found their own new rhythms. Over time, even the equator, in this new sense, finds a way to become something else. A place not defined by spin anymore, but by how people respond to the absence of that spin. But this redefinition of place isn't just about climate or culture. It's also about position itself. Because when the oceans slosh toward the poles and the crust flexes in response, the coordinates that describe where you are start to shift, even if you never move a step. You don't feel your hometown drift. Streets still lead in the same directions. Landmarks stand where you remember them. The mountain on the horizon looks unchanged. But in the geometry of a non-spinning Earth, your location is no longer quite what it was. For billions of years, latitude and longitude meant something stable. The equator was tied to the axis of rotation. Lines of latitude traced circles parallel to that spinning waste. Time zones, climate belts, ocean currents, all stacked neatly on top of that geometry. When you said you lived at a certain coordinate, you were also saying something about how the sun moved in your sky and how the air and water tended to behave around you. Without rotation, those relationships decouple. The equator is still mathematically definable, but it no longer carries the same dynamic meaning. Meanwhile, mass redistribution from ocean water flowing poleward and land rising or falling changes Earth's moment of inertia and subtle aspects of its gravitational field. Your official latitude may drift as geodesists update reference frames in response to a planet reshaping itself. A town, once plotted at 5 degrees north, might eventually be remeasured as 3 degrees north. even though no one felt so much as a jolt. In everyday terms, that means maps and GPS systems need constant recalibration. What used to be a fixed grid, draped over a mostly stable sphere, turns into a slowly deforming net over a planet that's still settling into its new form. Cartographers become chroniclers of motion, releasing new editions of global reference models every few years, then every year, if the changes accelerate. Rivers change course as elevations tilt and sag. Some basins become steeper, others flatten. Old river valleys might reverse flow or split. Human infrastructure, roads, railways, pipelines, built around those patterns suddenly finds itself misaligned. A route once protected from flooding by higher ground could end up sitting in a new low spot. The question of borders becomes more complex. When coastlines move and river paths shift, what does it mean for a boundary defined down the middle of the river or along the shoreline? When a capital that used to sit near the geographic center of a country now lies closer to its new periphery, do you move the institutions of power or leave them as fossilized remnants of an older geography? Some nations might seize the chance to renegotiate borders as land drowns or emerges. Others cling to legacy maps even when they no longer match reality, insisting that lines on paper matter more than the sea creeping through abandoned neighborhoods. Disputes over newly exposed seafloors rich in minerals or over altered river outlets could flare up, combining old territorial instincts with new, desperate resource needs. On a human scale, people experience this as a slow dissonance. The place your grandparents described its climate, its view of the sky, its distance from the sea, no longer matches what you see. You might stand in the central square of a town that was once inland and read memorial plaques about floods that feel impossible in the present configuration, or vice versa. Digital technology tries to keep up. Navigation apps integrate real-time topographic updates, warning you that a road is now prone to flooding or that an old coastal route is permanently under shallow water. Augmented reality overlays former coastlines or river paths onto your current surroundings so you can see, in ghostly traces, where the water used to be. Education adapts. Geography classes stop teaching maps as fixed reference objects. Instead, kids learn to think of Earth as a changing surface, a planet mid-transition, with latitudes and shorelines that are historical snapshots, rather than eternal truths. Atlases become layered, one page for then, one for now, one for projected soon. People start rating locations by stability as much as by beauty or economic promise. Real estate listings include data on elevation trends, projected flood risk given shifting seas, and expected changes in climate zone as the long year day slowly turns. Is this area growing? Becomes less about jobs, and more about whether the ground and weather will keep cooperating. Some regions embrace this fluidity. Cities advertise themselves as adaptable, built to shift with the land. Buildings are modular, utilities are flexible, streets can be rerouted without tearing everything up. Other places dig in, both literally and metaphorically, resisting change as long as they can, trying to freeze the old arrangements in place with engineering in denial. All of this motion of rock, water, coordinates, and meaning feeds back into the thing we used to rely on more than almost anything: the seasons. Because even if the planet no longer spins on its axis, it still circles the sun. And as it does, the patterns of heat and cold, wet and dry, that once followed neat seasonal arcs begin to warp into something less recognizable. The first thing people notice is that weather stops behaving like a traveling show and starts acting more like a house guest who won't leave. Storms no longer sweep across continents in familiar progressions. Pressure systems don't migrate on consistent tracks. The delicate interplay between spinning Earth, angled sunlight, and moving air that once gave us spring thaws, autumn chills, and monsoon onset dates is gone. There are still changes, shifts in temperature as your part of the planet slowly leans toward or away from the sun along its orbit. But without daily rotation mixing light and darkness, those changes feel long and blunt. For most of human history, we've been able to trust a few things: that winter would be followed by spring, that heat would eventually give way to cool, that rain would come more often in some months than others. Farmers tuned planting schedules to those rhythms. Cultures built holidays around them. Entire ecosystems grew up locked into patterns of bloom, dormancy, migration, and reproduction keyed to seasonal signals. Now, instead of an interplay of day-length changes and rotating air masses, you have static or slowly shifting regions of heat and cold, with localized circulation hammered into strange new shapes. On the day side, vast areas might settle into semi-permanent states, scorched, dry regions under unmoving high-pressure domes, and soggy, flood-prone zones beneath parked thundercloud towers. Instead of summer storms rolling through and then clearing, one place gets pounded for weeks while another sits under blazing, empty skies for months. On the night side, winter never ends in the old sense. The cold just deepens until the long, slow approach of the sun months later begins to thin the ice, slowly warm the air. Instead of 4 seasons in a year, you might get one extremely long transition from brutally cold and dark to slightly less cold and dim, and then back again. Along the twilight belt, where warm and cold air masses constantly clash, weather becomes jagged and hyper-local. Think of a place where it snows heavily on one side of a valley for days while the other side remains dry. Or where a band of freezing rain stations itself over one patch of land for a week while 10 kilometers away, conditions remain clear. Meteorologists move from forecasting broad, sweeping changes across regions to now casting narrow, shifting anomalies. The big picture, this will be a wet season, gives way to, this neighborhood will see a sharp drop in pressure in the next hour. Models run continuously, but the long-term confidence intervals shrink. The very idea of season begins to fray. Are you in winter if it's cold but the sun never rises? Are you in summer if the heat never breaks but the star is low on the horizon? Do those words even help anymore? People improvise new categories. They talk about burn periods on the dayside stretches when radiation and heat exceed certain thresholds. On the dark side, they speak of deep freeze, surface thaw, and light return, each lasting months. Weather becomes less of a background condition and more of an immediate concern, something everyone tracks closely. Apps show live microclimate feeds instead of neat one-week outlooks. Neighborhoods have their own localized forecasts. You might get an alert that says, expect freezing mist and high winds on your side of the hill for the next 6 hours, other side unaffected. Clothing and architecture lean toward versatility. Jackets that can switch quickly between insulating and breathable modes. Windows with smart glass that can adjust not just brightness but thermal properties. Homes that can seal themselves tightly against dust and cold, or open wide to capture rare breezes or glimpses of sun. Art starts to mourn and mythologize the old seasons. Songs and stories speak about autumn as a time when leaves change naturally in response to shortening days, not just to stress or frost. Spring, once a promise of renewal, becomes a metaphor more than a lived reality in many places. Some communities try to reconstruct seasons artificially. They program indoor environments to follow old Earth-like cycles. 3 months of cooler, dimmer light, 6 of moderate, 3 of warmer, brighter conditions. They plant and harvest according to these cycles, celebrate old holidays when the virtual leaves change in their controlled gardens. It's a way of carrying forward meaning in a world where the outside schedule no longer matches. And even as they do, outside those controlled spaces, life wild and human alike is busy doing what it's always done, looking for new rhythms. It's not that time has stopped. It's that the old clock was taken away, and everyone is searching for a new one. For ages, tides were like a quiet metronome along the world's coastlines. They rose and fell, drawn by the moon's gravity and nudged by the sun, shaped by bays and inlets and continental shelves. Twice a day in most places, the sea would creep in, then slip away. Fishers timed their work to it. Harbor masters tracked it. Whole coastal cultures absorbed that slow breathing of the ocean into their language, rituals, and schedules. But tides aren't just about the moon pulling on still water. They're about that pull acting on a planet that's turning. The bulges of water raised by lunar gravity move around the globe because the Earth spins underneath them. That's why the shoreline seems to advance and retreat. Take away the rotation, and that dance falters. At first, it's subtle, especially compared to everything else that's happening. The highest highs and lowest lows become slightly out of step. Then, more obviously, the familiar pattern thins out. Places used to 2 clear tides a day might see them become irregular, then slow. The timing tables that once predicted tide heights years in advance stop matching reality. The basic mechanics remain. The moon still pulls, so water still bulges on the side facing it and due to inertia on the side opposite it. But without the world spinning beneath those bulges, they no longer travel. They hang in place relative to the line connecting Earth and Moon. Coastlines directly under one of these bulges find themselves in a kind of semi-permanent high tide. The ocean there stays swollen against the land. The waterline creeps up and does not truly recede, at least not in the daily rhythm people knew. Waves still break, storms still push water around, but the baseline level is simply higher. Over time, beaches erode from constant pressure. Dunes disappear. Salt water infiltrates farther inland through soil and groundwater, changing the chemistry of everything it touches. On the opposite side of the planet, beneath the second bulge, another broad zone of elevated sea level exists. Between those bulged regions, in the transitional belts, water sits lower. Not a classic low tide, because it doesn't alternate with a high, but more like a permanent mid to low level state. Coastal communities there might watch as their shallow bays gradually shrink, mudflats expand, and harbor channels become too shallow for large vessels. Not because the tide went out, but because it never fully comes back. The entire system becomes less a pulse, and more a static tension between gravity and the shape of land and sea. Plants and animals that evolved with the twice-daily rhythm feel it first. Mangroves, rooted in intertidal zones, rely on alternating flooding and drainage. Their unique roots are adapted to those changing conditions. Permanently high or permanently low water throws that balance off. Some mangrove forests drown, others dry out and die. Rocky tide pools, those little worlds between land and ocean, stagnate. Without regular flushing, they overheat or cool too much. Their chemistry drifts. Creatures that relied on the refresh of each tide snails, sea stars, anemones, tiny fish find their miniature habitats turning hostile. Some can adapt or move, many can't. Whole food webs along shorelines begin to fray not in a single crash, but as one delicate link after another quietly slips away. Humans, dependent on tides in more ways than most people realize, scramble to adjust. Coastal engineers try to replace natural flushing in certain harbors and wetlands with mechanical systems. Gates and pumps move seawater in and out of enclosed bays on artificial schedules, trying to preserve ecologies that have always known the in and out breathing of the tide. In some places this works, at least partially. In others, the complexity of the original system proves too much to duplicate. Tidal power stations, those once promising sources of renewable energy, go offline, or are completely redesigned. A dam or turbine built to capture predictable twice-daily rises and falls becomes useless in a world where water levels barely move. Some facilities are retrofitted to operate like pumped storage systems, using surplus energy at certain times to move water, then capturing it later. Out in the open ocean, the moon's grip is still there. But another subtle change is happening in the Earth-Moon relationship. In our spinning world, the interaction between tides and rotation acts like a brake. Tidal friction gradually slows Earth's spin and transfers energy to the moon's orbit, nudging it slowly farther away, centimeters per year. Fossil records and precise measurements bear this out. Days used to be shorter. The moon used to be closer. Without rotation, that source of friction evaporates. The tidal bulges no longer constantly drag against the seafloor in the same way, and the exchange of angular momentum between Earth and Moon drops dramatically. The moon's outward drift slows and could even halt. Over immense spans of time, its orbit might adjust into a slightly tighter configuration, although that process would be slow and complex. From the ground, the immediate effect is that the moon's apparent size and distance stabilize. No more creeping away decade by decade. No longer a silent, slow retreat. In the sky, it becomes less of a timekeeper. Tidal cycles are no longer helpful markers. Lunar calendars tied to fishing, planting, and religious observance become detached from anything physical happening on the shore. The moon still goes through phases as it orbits the sunlit Earth, but for many people, those phases no longer correlate with environmental cues like tides or nocturnal brightness in quite the same way. In some regions, especially on the day side, the moon may be visible only as a washed-out disk in a too bright sky when geometry allows. On the night side, it could sometimes dominate the darkness for weeks on end, hanging in roughly the same part of the sky each night, casting hard-edged shadows that feel more like stage lighting than gentle lunar glow. Cultures respond. Moon festivals continue, but their symbolism shifts. The moon becomes less about marking change and more about representing persistence, something that keeps returning to the same parts of the sky when so much else has shifted. Myths may evolve, casting the moon as a steadfast witness to a world whose spin has failed. Marine animals that use the moon and tides as navigational anchors would struggle at first. Fish that spawned during certain phases of the tide, crabs that marched in synchronized runs up beaches, turtles that once timed their nesting to moments of low water and soft moonlight. These behaviors may misfire repeatedly before either fading away or adapting to new triggers. Over time, some species might begin keying off other cues, temperature gradients, currents, even human-made light or noise. Others might vanish, unable to adjust their deeply wired life cycles. For us, the economic and practical impacts at the coastlines are profound. Flood risk calculations have to be rebuilt from scratch. High tide lines, as we knew them, no longer apply, replaced by new sea-level baselines that depend on your position under or between the moon-induced bulges. Some once flood-prone areas become relatively safer, others permanently at risk. And just as we begin adapting to this mostly static ocean surface, something subtler shifts far above, in the invisible shield that has always stood between us and much of the sun's wrath. Because the Earth doesn't just spin rock and water, it also spins molten metal. And that motion has been generating a magnetic field for as long as life has needed a little help holding onto its air. From the outside, Earth doesn't look like a magnet. There are no giant bar poles sticking out of the crust, but instruments tell us it is one, effectively a huge, off-center dipole with stray complexities. Deep beneath the mantle, in the outer core, a vast ocean of liquid iron and nickel churns. Heated from below and cooled from above, it swirls in convection currents. The planet's rotation nudges those flows into organized patterns, loops and spirals that give rise to electric currents, and those currents generate our magnetic field. This whole process is called the geodynamo. Slow or stop the rotation, and you interfere with one of the main organizational forces behind that dynamo. The core doesn't freeze immediately, it's far too hot, and there's still plenty of internal heat driving convection. But the pattern of that motion can change. Currents become less aligned. Flow paths stretch, stall, or reorient. The magnetic field weakens. You wouldn't notice it strolling down the street. Gravity would feel the same. Birds would still circle overhead at first, but magnetometers around the globe would start logging declining field strength. Satellites would detect more high-energy particles getting closer to Earth. The auroras, the northern and southern lights would begin to show up in latitudes where no one had ever seen them before, rippling green and red over cities that once only knew them from photographs. For many, that would be beautiful. For infrastructure, it's a warning, because the sun doesn't only bathe us in visible light and warmth. It constantly streams out charged particles in the solar wind, and occasionally hurls out immense blasts of plasma and coronal mass ejections. Normally, Earth's magnetic field deflects most of this. The magnetosphere wraps around the planet like a shield, diverting particles away or funneling them harmlessly toward the poles. As that shield thins, more of those particles crash into the upper atmosphere. At high altitudes, radiation levels rise. Commercial airline crews and frequent flyers already exposed to more cosmic rays than people on the ground face increased risks. Flight paths get rerouted away from certain altitudes or latitudes during solar storms. Airlines retrofit planes with better shielding. Regulators issue tighter limits on cumulative exposure for workers. Satellites suffer more. Their electronics are vulnerable to energetic particles that can flip bits in memory, damage circuits, or knock systems offline. Engineers harden new generations of satellites with radiation-resistant components and redundant pathways. Despite that, space weather begins to cause more frequent outages. Some orbits become less attractive or even untenable for certain types of equipment. We start to build redundancy, not just on the ground, but in orbit. Backup communication channels. Regional rather than global systems, caches of critical data stored across multiple layers of the network. At ground level, the effect is slower but still significant. The weakened field allows more solar particles to induce currents in long conductors, power lines, pipelines, undersea cables. Strong solar storms can already cause geomagnetically induced currents that stress transformers or disrupt service. With a weaker field, those events become more severe and frequent. Power grid operators install advanced surge protection and automatic disconnects. Utilities build more localized, islandable grids that can temporarily decouple from large networks to protect themselves during big solar events. Blackout drills become as routine as storm or earthquake preparations once were. Health systems adjust as well. Public advisories during periods of heightened solar activity don't just suggest aurora watching. They warn certain vulnerable populations to limit outdoor time, especially at higher elevations or near the geomagnetic equator where protection has dropped the most. Portable radiation monitors become common in hospitals, research labs, aviation, even some households. Migratory animals that navigate using the magnetic field, birds, sea turtles, some whales, even certain insects, face a world where their invisible map is fading or distorting. Some species may follow their routes stubbornly into the wrong places. Others start mixing cues, using smell, wind patterns, landmarks, or even human-generated signals to reorient. Conservationists might try luring them with artificial beacons or modified habitats. There would be successes and quiet failures. And then there's the atmosphere itself. For billions of years, the magnetic field has helped shield Earth's upper layers of air from being gradually stripped by the solar wind. It's not the only factor gravity and composition matter, but it's important. On Mars, which lost most of its magnetic field long ago, thin air and a harsh radiation environment remain as a cautionary tale. As Earth's field slackens, the rate at which high-energy particles knock atmospheric molecules into space slowly increases. Hydrogen and oxygen, set free from water and other compounds in the upper atmosphere, leak into space at a slightly higher rate. This is not an overnight choke-off. We're talking about small changes stretched over very long periods, centuries, millennia, more. But the trajectory matters. Higher energy portions of the sun's output nibble at our air more aggressively. Over truly vast timescales, the composition and density of the atmosphere could shift, with knock-on effects for climate and habitability. Scientists would argue over how quickly and how severely that might happen. Some would say, we'll adapt technologically long before it's truly dire. Others would point to early measurements of atmospheric loss as the first cracks in a shield we once took for granted. Either way, the psychological impact is real. For the first time, humanity becomes broadly aware that the planet is more exposed than it used to be. Not catastrophically so, not yet, but measurably. And underneath the numbers and reports, under the auroras and outages and new protective gear, something more intimate is changing as well. Because when sun, sky, tides, and seasons stop giving us reliable rhythm, we start looking inward for a sense of time. Not the time of atomic clocks and precision intervals, the time written into us. Time existed before clocks ever did. Long before anyone carved marks into bone or stone to track days, we knew time through experience by watching the sky, the arc of shadows, the cycles of plants and animals. The Earth's rotation was the original metronome. Dawn to noon to dusk to night. Over and over. So reliable that we built every routine and story around it. That 24-hour spin gave shape to everything. Sleep, work, worship, travel, trade. It broke life down into understandable, repeatable pieces. With the spin gone, our external reference shatters. Clocks keep working. Atomic time doesn't care if the Earth turns or not. Satellites and oscillating cesium atoms happily tick away, perfect as ever. But 24 hours on a display doesn't feel like a day if the sun hasn't moved. Technically, you still have seconds, minutes, hours. Subjectively, something vital is missing. On the perpetual day side, people try very hard to simulate the old cycle. Smart homes close shutters and dim lights according to artificial schedules. Apps fade interior brightness in the evening and warm its color temperature to mimic sunset. Alarm clocks chime when they should. Yet the body knows the light is still out there. It leaks in around curtains, under doors, through reflective glow. The subconscious mind reads that constant brightness as day, even when the clock insists it's midnight. Sleep becomes fragmented short, shallow stretches instead of deep, restorative blocks. People experiment with different sleep patterns, multiple naps instead of one long rest, carefully timed melatonin supplements, strict dark phases where all screens and lamps are shut off by agreement. Employers offer controlled light workspaces as a health benefit. On the dark side, the reverse. People wake up to alarms, not to sunrise. They eat breakfast in lamplit rooms, knowing full well that at any moment outside, it's still night. Artificial daylight at full spectrum helps align bodies somewhat, but many people still report feeling off sleepy at odd moments, wide awake during designated sleep hours, unsure whether they've been awake for 10 hours or 16. Constant darkness messes with more than sleep. Appetite, digestion, hormone cycles, cognitive performance. All of it is tuned, at least in part, to light cues. In their absence, people lean more heavily on routine and technology. Wearables track sleep quality and heart rate, then suggest tailored schedules. Light therapy booths offer sun sessions at various public hubs. On both sides of the world, many people's internal clocks begin to drift when they're not actively managed. Left alone in constant conditions, a lot of human bodies naturally settle into schedules slightly longer than 24 hours, 25, 26, sometimes more. In the old world, sunrise reset those drifts every morning. Now there's nothing to do the resetting unless we create it. Global coordination phrase. Time zones once rooted in where the sun stood overhead become arbitrary. Some regions cling to coordinated universal time. Others adopt local orbital time, syncing their clocks to where they are in the planet's slow, year-long turn around the sun. International meetings, once just annoying to schedule across a 24-hour span, become puzzles of phase alignment. People don't just ask, "What time is it where you are?" They ask, "Are you in your wake phase? Are you coming off sleep?" A 9 a.m. meeting might now mean 9 a.m. according to the shared standard, but half the participants are in their personal evening segment. Businesses and institutions adapt. Some move to purely asynchronous work, abandoning real-time interaction as a primary mode. Others operate on continuous rolling shifts, with teams hand off projects every few hours to keep operations 24/7 without burning anyone out. Customer service bots and AI systems cover the gaps where humans can't or refuse to stay awake on unnatural schedules. Social life contorts around these differences. Couples and families sometimes find their internal clocks drifting apart. One person naturally settling into a 26-hour rhythm, another clinging to 24-hour cycles, a third working a job that operates on a 20-hour schedule. Negotiating shared mealtimes, conversations, or sleep in the same bed becomes a delicate balancing act. Some subcultures opt out of shared time altogether. They live on wild time, waking and sleeping when their bodies want to, eating when hungry, working when focus strikes. It sounds chaotic, but within those communities, looser norms may take shape. People drop messages instead of scheduling calls. Gatherings are announced as spanning wide windows, come anytime during this phase, rather than sharp clock times. Other groups go in the opposite direction. They hold onto the 24-hour day like a lifeline. They set strict hours for prayer, meals, work, and rest, refusing to let the unmoving sky dictate their inner world. For them, maintaining the old daily cycle becomes a matter of identity, even resistance. we are still people of days and nights, whether or not the sun cooperates. Language morphs accordingly. Good morning becomes less tied to actual sunrise and more of a polite marker for, I know you've recently woken up. You might greet someone with, hope your last sleep was good, or are you in your work block or your rest block? It's getting late shifts from meaning the sun is going down to your phase is winding down. Art drifts with this new temporal fluidity. Movies, books, and music stop leaning so heavily on the visual cues of dawn, afternoon, dusk, and midnight. Stories become less anchored to specific times of day and more to emotional or psychological states. A scene might be described simply as during his tired phase, instead of late at night. Non-linear narratives that jump around in time resonate more with people whose own days no longer follow straightforward arcs. Religions and spiritual traditions adjust. Some maintain strict sunrise and sunset rites performed according to historical or astronomical calculations rather than the actual sky. Others reinvent sacred rhythms around rest and attention rather than around light. Daily periods of reflection, service, silence, or celebration that follow an internal or communal clock instead of the sun. Through it all, our biology keeps trying to run its old program. Cells still cycle gene expression on roughly 24-hour loops. Hormones still ebb and flow. It's just that now, the external soundtrack is out of sync. So we do what we always do when the environment changes faster than our bodies can. We improvise tools, rituals, and frameworks to bridge the gap. We build personal routines like scaffolding around our days. We find comfort in repeating patterns at the same time, walks during the same phase, shared meals at agreed upon intervals, even when everything outside looks the same hour after hour after hour. And as we do, we begin to realize that a day was never just about the Earth's rotation. It was also about the stories and structures we built inside that rotation. Those can be rebuilt, even when the sky refuses to turn. But there is one rhythm we still haven't fully touched: the year. Because while the daily spin may be gone, the planet still orbits the sun. And that orbit, slow and steady, becomes the only true celestial movement left. On a planet that no longer turns, you don't wake up to sunrise anymore. Light doesn't nudge its way through your curtains, climbing the walls, shifting colors from blue to gold. The air doesn't take on that faintly different smell of early morning. Birds don't start their chorus as the sky lightens, because without rotation the sun doesn't rise. It just sits where geometry puts it and then creeps, painfully slowly, as the entire planet moves around it. Earth still orbits the sun. Roughly 365 days, one full lap, just like before. But in the absence of spin, that orbit stops being the backdrop and becomes the only real motion that matters. One day, in the old sense of the ground turning once, now stretches across an entire year. At first, that's easy to miss. The sun seems frozen at some angle, a bright mark in the sky that never quite shifts from 1 hour to the next. But if you track its position over weeks, you start to see it. A tiny slide along the horizon, a barely noticeable climb or drop. This slow journey becomes the new definition of day. On the side of the planet facing the sun, the cycle unfolds over 6 long months. It begins as a low glow, a long, gentle dawn that takes weeks to become fully bright. The sun inches higher day by day. Not that you can see the change from one breakfast to the next, but over time, shadows shrink, angles sharpen, warmth builds. Plants still capable of responding to light will track this shift in exaggerated slow motion. Instead of tracing the sun across the sky over hours, they tilt imperceptibly over weeks. About 3 months into this half-year day, the sun reaches its highest point. It hovers near the zenith for weeks on end. This is solar noon in the new sense intense, unwavering. The ground, buildings, water, and air absorb heat constantly. Energy use soars as people fight to keep living spaces at survivable temperatures. Solar power is abundant, but so is demand. Under such prolonged noon, cities adjust schedules aggressively. Outdoor work is limited or banned during the peak period. People shift most activity to sheltered spaces or to phases of the cycle when temperatures drop a few degrees. Still, the sun doesn't dip. It has to wait for Earth to progress further along its orbit before it can begin sliding down. Eventually, it does. Weeks pass. The sun's angle begins to lower. Light becomes less vertical, less punishing. Shadows stretch again, very slowly. The world enters what once might have been called late afternoon. Only now it lasts an entire season. Colors soften, heat retreats. The sunset, when it comes, is not one evening but many. For more than a month, the sun appears to hover near the horizon, bleeding the sky into prolonged gradients of orange and red. The phrase golden hour stops meaning 60 minutes of magic light and starts meaning a whole chapter of the year long enough for people to build festivals, markets, even cultural identities around it. Finally, the sun disappears completely beneath the horizon. On the opposite side of the planet, everything has been working in reverse. While one hemisphere endured its drawn-out day, the other lay in its own extended night. No twilight, no quick dusk. Just blackness punctured by stars that never wheel across the sky. Constellations remain pinned in place. You could press a clear plate of glass up to the horizon, mark out the stars you see, and weeks later, your scribbles would still line up. The moon appears when its orbit brings it into view, sometimes hanging for weeks in the same sector of the sky, sometimes absent for long stretches. Its phases are still tied to its position relative to the sun and Earth. But for those living in the dark, the timing of that cycle may feel disconnected from daily life, which is governed less by sky glow and more by household routines and artificial lights. As months pass, temperatures fall further. The long night becomes an existential season. People prepare for it the way ancient societies once prepared for winter, except this winter lasts nearly half a year and brings a level of cold and dark most earlier humans never had to imagine. When the glow of first light finally appears low on the horizon, it's an event in itself. Not a quick change, but a drawn-out transformation. Over weeks, that faint band brightens, then expands, until at last the sun itself edges into view and starts its months-long climb. Human societies reformat their sense of time around this new framework. On the day side, morning now spans months of gradually intensifying light. Midday becomes an extended period of searing overhead sun. Evening stretches into a long, cooling glow. Night is a memory for half the year, and a reality for the other half. Calendars split accordingly. People begin to treat the 6-month day and 6-month night as fundamental units of life. Some communities define their year as one full light-dark cycle in their region, not necessarily a full lap around the sun. Others stick with the familiar 12-month count, but divide it differently. Dawn quarter, noon quarter, dusk quarter, night quarter. Education, economies, and social schedules align to these prolonged phases. School terms might begin at first light and end before deep dusk. Agricultural seasons compress into the months where temperatures and light intensity sit in narrow, viable bands. Marriage ceremonies, major festivals, and civic events cluster near the transitional periods, when the sky is changing and the climate is briefly less extreme. Industries tailor operations to the year-long day structure. Power generation, resource extraction, construction, and transport all shift strategies depending on whether a region is in ascending light, peak light, descending light, or full dark. Insurance policies incorporate orbital phase as a risk factor. Premiums differ for handling infrastructure during months of intense solar load versus months of deep freeze. Space agencies choreograph launches and returns around local solar midnight or solar dusk, minimizing radiation exposure or taking advantage of certain atmospheric conditions. Health services schedule mass vaccinations, screenings, or mental health initiatives around known stress points, like the onset of long darkness or the midpoint of unending sun. Over time, this slowly moving sun becomes a new kind of clock. People talk about where their city is in the day more than about dates. We're just past solar noon here, someone might say, even if the clock reads what used to be December. Or, we're in the long sunset phase now. Temperatures are finally dropping. There's an odd familiarity in it. The old 24-hour cycle is gone, but its patterned dawn, noon, dusk, night still exists, stretched across 365 days instead of one. It's as if the planet took a breath that used to last seconds and extended it to a year. Inhale, 6 months of light. Exhale, 6 months of dark. Animals, too, wrestle with this new pacing. They don't know what a day should be in the abstract. They know change light to dark, warm to cool, cues that whisper go or stay, eat or conserve. Nocturnal species on the eternal day side lose their advantage. With no night, they either adapt to become crepuscular active in the dimmer edges of that long sunrise and sunset, or vanish. On the dark side, diurnal creatures must either hibernate, migrate, or shift their patterns to follow artificial light or rare glimmers of dawn. Migratory animals that once synced their movements to seasonal cues face total confusion. If the equator no longer guarantees certain day lengths or temperatures, old routes and destinations become traps. Birds might set off on journeys that used to lead to lush feeding grounds only to arrive in frozen wastelands or sun-blasted deserts. Some will fail. Others, over generations, will discover new paths, perhaps shadowing the moving twilight fringe or clustering in the few remaining moderately stable microclimates. Plants that once budded or shed leaves based on day length now respond primarily to temperature, soil moisture, or internal programs. But those, too, have limits. Many species simply can't handle half a year of continuous sunlight or dark. The vegetation that remains is what can handle extremes: hardy perennials, drought-tolerant shrubs, deep-rooted desert or tundra specialists, opportunistic colonizers that can take rapid advantage of brief, favorable intervals. We often imagine end-of-the-world scenarios as total collapse, everything failing at once. In reality, what we'd likely see is a layered reshaping. Some life falters quickly, other life hangs on. Still other organisms move in to fill newly opened niches. Even in this extreme, a kind of ecology would emerge. Not the one we knew, not one we would choose, but one that fits the new constraints of a planet with year-long days and nights. And humans, caught in between, would find ways to keep going. Societies reorganize around the habitable zones. Migration patterns change from north-south to radial, toward or away from the line of endless twilight. Some political entities fracture as parts of their territory become permanently unlivable. Others form new alliances based on shared conditions: sunside coalitions, nightside networks, twilight corridor federations. Technology becomes both a lifeline and a dividing line. Those with advanced infrastructure, climate-controlled cities, underground agriculture, resilient energy grids weather the changes more comfortably. Those without are forced into nomadic lifestyles, mass relocation, or harsh local improvisations. Amid all of this, some people cling fiercely to old concepts of time and order. Others see a chance to let go of schedules shaped by a sky that no longer moves, and to define life by human needs instead of solar appearances. But the question remains, underneath the thought experiment, could any of this actually happen? Could the Earth realistically come to a stop beneath us? In reality, no. At least, not like this, and not on any time scale that matters to our species. Earth spins because of how it formed. In the early solar system, swirling clouds of dust and rock collapsed under gravity. As they pulled inward, conservation of angular momentum dictated that rotation would speed up, much like a spinning skater tucking in their arms. That rotational energy has been with us ever since. There's no motor that needs fuel, no engine that must be wound. In the frictionless near vacuum of space, an object in motion tends to stay in motion. There are forces that nibble away at that spin, primarily tidal interactions with the moon, but they're tiny. That's why days are slowly lengthening, but at a rate of about 1.7 milliseconds per century. Over hundreds of millions of years. That adds up. Fossil corals show daily growth rings that reveal more than 400 days in a year, hundreds of millions of years ago. Shorter days, faster spin. Project that process far forward, and in theory, you could imagine Earth becoming tidally locked with the sun. One hemisphere always facing starward, the other always facing away. That's the configuration we've been imagining here, more or less. But the timescales involved are staggering longer than the expected remaining lifespan of the sun itself before it swells into a red giant and irreversibly alters or destroys the inner planets. In other words, Earth likely won't ever naturally reach that fully locked state in a way any human civilization will see. And sudden stops? Those are even more far-fetched. The energy required to bring the planet's rotation to a halt quickly is so enormous, and the mechanisms to do so absent that we can leave it confidently in the realm of fiction. So why walk through all of this? Because sometimes, by imagining what happens when we remove one piece of the system, especially a piece we never think about, we see how dependent we are on it. We learn which parts of our world are held together by that unseen motion. We see which elements of life, oceans, air, climate, timekeeping, biology, are quietly synchronized with the spin beneath us. We also get a glimpse of how resilient some things are. Life, in many forms, adapts. People, in all their stubbornness and creativity, adapt. Even in a universe where the worst has already happened, there are always stories of adjustment, invention, persistence. But for now, and for a very long time to come, the Earth keeps turning. Your days still have sunrises and sunsets. Your circadian rhythms still match the arc of light and shadow. Morning light still feels different than evening light. You can still tell time by the angle of a shadow on the ground, and you still share a 24-hour cycle with billions of others. By stepping into an unmoving world, we can step back into our spinning one with different eyes. The rotation we never feel becomes easier to notice in its consequences. In the steady alternation of day and night, in the trade winds and jet streams, in the familiar turn of seasons, even in the way your body starts to get sleepy at roughly the same point every evening. It's a quiet miracle. This constant gentle carry through space. A background hum we never hear, shaping everything we do. And even in the imagined stillness, we found rhythm again. We recreated it with technology, with routine, with culture, with biology doing its best to keep time. That's what we do. We take whatever motion or lack of motion the universe offers and build meaning on top of it. So if, somehow, the planet ever did stop spinning, you already know the broad strokes of what might follow. Broken oceans, screaming winds, failing fields, migrating cities, new calendars, altered bodies, strange skies and people, still trying, still telling stories. But it won't. Not for us. Not now. Tonight, as you listen, you are turning. The ground beneath you is quietly carrying you eastward. The sky is slowly changing. Somewhere on the other side of the world, dawn is already brightening. Somewhere else, the first stars are coming out. You don't have to feel any of it for it to be real. You can just lie there, breathe, and know that the world is still in motion, still giving you tomorrow, whether you notice the spin or not. Good night.